For nearly 2 centuries, in the very heart of Europe, a single struggle refused to end. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a land of forests and rivers, a land small enough to be overlooked on an imperial map, yet stubborn enough that no emperor could ever fully control it. The kingdom of Bohemia lived under the shadow of an empire that called itself holy and imagined itself eternal. And in that long shadow, the seeds of conflict took root. Slowly at first, then with a force that reshaped the continent. This is the story of a kingdom determined to stand on its own feet, even as the greatest political entity of the Middle Ages pressed upon it from all sides. A story of monarchs who dreamed too boldly, nobles who schemed too loudly, and common people who carried the weight of decisions made far above their heads. It is a story of faith and defiance, of sermons whispered in the dark, of armies marching through snow and mud, of kings crowned and kings betrayed. It stretches across nearly 186 years, long enough for entire families to live out their lives without ever knowing a world untouched by tension or war. The conflict between Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire was not one war. It was many, not one crisis, but a chain of crises, each feeding the next. It was a rhythm of rebellion and reprisal, of uneasy truths and sudden betrayals. Sometimes it played out on open battlefields. Sometimes it was fought in council halls, in cathedrals, and in narrow city streets. But always, it endured. Always, it burned just beneath the surface. At first glance, it might seem improbable. How could a single kingdom, modest in size, tucked between mountains and forest challenge, the authority of an empire that stretched across Central Europe? How could Bohemia resist emperors who believed their rights flowed from God himself? How could one land, smaller than many imperial duchies, refuse to submit? The answer begins with pride. Bohemia was no ordinary province. It was a land whose rulers traced their lineage back to the earliest medieval chronicles. The Přemyslid dynasty had cultivated a deep sense of identity. Bohemia stood at the crossroads of trade. Silver veins ran beneath its soil. Its people were not merely subjects. They were participants in a long tradition of resilience. The empire expected obedience. Bohemia expected respect. Between those two expectations lay the spark that needed only the slightest breath to ignite. By the 12th century, the relationship between Bohemia and the empire was already strained. The empire demanded loyalty in wars, taxes in lean times, and influence over succession. The Bohemian nobles bristled, pushing back where they could. Each side watched the other with careful calculation. A misstep could unravel delicate balance. The first open ruptures came with disputes over the Bohemian throne itself. Imperial rulers insisted they held the right to approve or deny Bohemian kings. Local noble families resisted fiercely. The empire wanted authority. Bohemia wanted autonomy. Soon, the question of who should rule Bohemia became a battlefield before any swords ever crossed. Princes traveled to imperial courts to seek support. Rivals bribed influential electors. Promises were made. Alliances forged. Loyalties traded like coins. Every succession dispute carved deeper grooves into a relationship already growing brittle. Yet, as tense as these early conflicts were, they were only the beginning. The real fire was lit when Bohemian ambition collided with imperial fear. Ottokar II, the Iron and Golden King, transformed the kingdom from a regional power into a dominant force. Under his rule, Bohemia expanded its reach across Austria, Styria, and further still. He was admired by many chroniclers, feared by even more. His conquests were not gentle. His rise unsettled the empire. Here was a king who acted like an emperor, who rode at the head of armies that rivaled those of imperial princes, who looked upon imperial lands with hungry eyes. His ambition was too bright to ignore. The empire responded with determination. The confrontation that followed shattered Ottokar's power and changed the course of Bohemia forever. The death of Ottokar II was not just the fall of a king. It was a message. The empire had struck back, and Bohemia felt the blow. Yet even in defeat, the kingdom refused to submit completely. Resistance hardened. Distrust deepened. The wounds would fester for generations. Bohemia rose again under Wenceslas II, fueled by the astonishing wealth of the silver mines at Kutna Hora. The mines brought not only fortune, but competence and another measure of imperial suspicion. When the Přemyslid dynasty collapsed with the murder of Wenceslas III, Bohemia was once again exposed to imperial influence. Foreign claimants scrambled for the vacant throne. The empire attempted to shape Bohemia's future by deciding who would rule it, but the kingdom was not as weak as it appeared. Its nobles demanded a voice. Its people held to their traditions. A new dynasty, the Luxembourg line, emerged from the struggle. John of Luxembourg and his son, Charles IV, reshaped Bohemia's political landscape. Charles, both emperor and king, brought a rare harmony between Prague and the imperial court. Under him, Bohemia became a cultural and intellectual center of Europe. But even a golden age could not erase the underlying tension. For beneath the surface lay a deeper conflict, one that no emperor could solve. It began with questions whispered in sermons and argued in university halls. It began with dissatisfaction, with moral outrage, with a desire for reform. It began with a preacher named Jan Hus. His words struck like lightning across Bohemia. He spoke of corruption, of renewal, of a church that had strayed from its purpose. People listened. Families, merchants, craftsmen, students. They saw in his message a reflection of their own frustrations. The empire, intertwined with the church, saw something far more dangerous. When Hus was summoned to stand before the Council of Constance, he went believing he would be heard. Instead, he was silenced forever. His execution ignited a fury that no imperial army could extinguish. Bohemia erupted, and the long conflict entered its most violent phase. For nearly 20 years, the Hussite Wars raged, wars between rebels and crusaders, between reformers and traditionalists, between a kingdom determined to defend its conscience and an empire determined to enforce its authority. These wars were not fought by elite knights alone. They were fought by farmers, millers, stonemasons, and townspeople who refused to surrender. They fought using wagons fortified into barricades, using weapons crafted from farm tools, using a unity born of belief. They fought under leaders like Jan Žižka, whose skill in battle reshaped medieval warfare. Crusade after crusade marched into Bohemia. Crusade after crusade was driven back. The empire learned that forcing a kingdom to kneel was far harder than it looked on parchment. But Bohemia, though unbroken, was exhausted. Internal divisions deepened. Radical factions turned against moderate ones. The fire that had united the kingdom now threatened to tear it apart. And so, after years of bloodshed, compromised peace slowly emerged. Yet the story did not end. Power shifted, kings rose and fell. The empire regained momentum. Bohemia's religious and political identity continued to evolve. At last, after 186 long years, the waves of war, rebellion, reform, and resistance slowly receded. But their imprint remained. The conflict had changed Bohemia. It had changed the empire. It had changed the very map of Europe. This is the story of that transformation. A story of endurance measured not in battles, but in lifetimes. A story of kings who could not control their kingdoms, and kingdoms that refused to yield to empire. A story of faith, powerful enough to unite a people and to divide them. A story of how a small land in the center of Europe faced the weight of an empire and endured, again and again. This is the story of Bohemia versus the Holy Roman Empire, a conflict that spanned nearly 2 centuries. A conflict that shaped a nation, a conflict that refused to fade into silence. For nearly 2 centuries, the lands of Bohemia lived at the crossroads of forces larger than themselves. A kingdom set in the heart of Europe, rich in forests, silver, and proud traditions, found itself bound, sometimes willingly, sometimes under the weight of crown and church, to the sprawling, uneasy, and often fractious body known as the Holy Roman Empire. The tensions that grew between these two worlds did not form in a moment. They were shaped by geography, molded by politics, sharpened by theology, and hardened by the slow grinding of imperial and local ambitions. To understand the long arc of this 186-year conflict, one must first understand Bohemia itself. It was not a marginal land clinging to survival. It was a kingdom with real authority, ancient ruling houses, and a deeply rooted sense of identity. Nestled in what is today the Czech Republic, Bohemia was protected by natural borders, mountains that insulated it from invaders. river systems that sustained its agriculture, and trade routes that tied it to the world beyond. Its people were Slavic, but its kings often found themselves connected to German dynasties, imperial politics, and the shifting loyalties of medieval Europe. In this tension between the kingdom's Slavic soul and its political entanglement with German power lay a source of constant friction. The Holy Roman Empire, by contrast, was not a single realm, but an intricate web of bishoprics, counties, and free cities. Its emperor ruled through consent as much as command, balancing the egos of princes and bishops, obligated to respect old rites while enforcing new order. It was vast, yet often fragile, prestigious, yet endlessly divided. And at its core sat an idea that the emperor was both heir to Rome and protector of Christendom. This idea gave the emperor extraordinary symbolic power, but also a responsibility to maintain unity, and unity, in the medieval world, often meant demanding obedience. Bohemia's kings were technically imperial vassals, but they were not ordinary vassals. The Bohemian crown was one of the empire's most prestigious titles, granting its ruler the status of elector. This dual birthright proud independence at home, high honor within the emperor made Bohemia both indispensable and dangerous in imperial politics. When relations were warm, Bohemia strengthened the empire. When relations soured, the empire trembled. Before swords were ever drawn, the seeds of conflict lay in questions that had no easy answers. What did it mean to be a king within an empire? How far could local customs defy imperial authority? Could a kingdom owe loyalty to an emperor while claiming ancient autonomy? These were the questions that would echo across generations, rising whenever a succession was disputed, whenever a bishopric was contested, whenever the fraught balance of regional and imperial power tipped too far in either direction. It is tempting to imagine this 186-year saga as one continuous war, but it was not. Medieval Europe did not operate like modern nation-states. Alliances shifted like sand. Conflicts tended to flare, cool, and flare again. What connected these confrontations was not a single battlefield or a single grievance, but a persistent tension, political, economic, and above all, spiritual. For Bohemia, resisting imperial control became a matter of identity. For the empire, asserting authority over Bohemia became a test of legitimacy. The first phase of this story is rooted in the Přemyslid dynasty, the ancient ruling family of Bohemia. They cultivated autonomy fiercely, pushing for recognition from both emperor and pope. Their kings built fortified towns, managed lucrative silver mines, and strengthened the Bohemian estate structure. Yet they were constantly aware that their crown depended in part on imperial favor. Whenever a Přemyslid king acted too boldly, he risked provoking the emperor. Whenever he acted too cautiously, he risked losing the respect of his own nobles. After the extinction of the Přemyslids in the early 14th century, Bohemia fell into the hands of the Luxembourg dynasty, a transition that at first seemed to promise stability. Charles IV, the most famous of the Luxembourgs, became both King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor. Under his rule, Prague rose to become the cultural and political center of the empire. He granted charters, built bridges, founded institutions, and codified electoral law. For a moment, Bohemia and the empire were not rivals, but two bodies, ruled by one mind. Yet even this golden age contained the seeds of future unrest. Charles's emphasis on Bohemia, on Prague, on building a local identity that rivaled imperial identity, created tensions his successors could not manage. His death fractured the delicate equilibrium he had maintained. Subsequent emperors lacked his authority. Bohemian nobles gained more independence. The imperial court became increasingly wary of the power that Bohemia wielded, and beneath the surface, religious tensions simmered. Those religious tensions would soon erupt in ways that neither kings nor emperors could control. The early 15th century witnessed the rise of Jan Hus, a preacher whose calls for reform drew huge support among the people of Bohemia. Hus criticized clerical corruption, challenged papal authority, and demanded a more moral and transparent church. His teachings spread quickly, carried by students, priests, and townspeople. For many Bohemians, his words tapped into a deeper frustration, not just with the church, but with imperial entanglements that seemed to drag their kingdom into conflicts that served foreign interests. Hus Execution at the Council of Constance in 1415, condemned by church leaders and tacitly supported by imperial authority. An inferno, the Hussite Wars that followed were not a mere rebellion. They were a revolution, both national and spiritual. A declaration that Bohemia would not be subdued by emperor or pope. Hussite armies defeated multiple imperial crusades, using tactics and discipline that stunned contemporary chroniclers. Their defiance shook the empire to its core, yet even victory came at a heavy price. Bohemia was scarred by internal divisions between radical and moderate reformers. Nobles struggled against commoners. Towns competed for influence. The empire, too, suffered political embarrassment and military exhaustion. When compromise finally emerged decades later, it was fragile, bitter, and incomplete. The Hussite era reshaped Bohemia's identity. It also ensured that tensions with the empire would endure long after the last Crusader banner fell. The final phase of this long conflict unfolded in the late medieval period, when Bohemia sought to preserve the religious freedoms it had secured while the empire tried to reassert unity. New emperors rose, determined to bring Bohemia back into alignment with imperial and Catholic norms. New Bohemian leaders resisted, invoking the memory of Hus and the autonomy their forebears had fought to protect. Economic motives played their part as well. The silver mines of Kutna-Hora, trade rights in Prague, and control of regional markets all influenced the balance of power. By the end of the 186 years, both sides had been transformed. The empire's authority, already complicated by its decentralized structure, had been tested repeatedly. Bohemia had endured waves of war, yet emerged with a distinct identity shaped by its defiance. Nothing in this long struggle can be reduced to a single cause. It was not simply about borders, or kingship, or doctrine. It was about who had the right to shape a kingdom's destiny. Its own people, or the distant emperor who claimed universal authority. This documentary will follow that entire arc, from the last strong Přemyslid kings to the final settlements that closed the medieval chapter of Bohemian imperial conflict. It will explore the courts of emperors and the councils of nobles, the sermons of reformers and the strategies of generals, the villages burned in campaigns and the cities that rose again after war. Each chapter will show how the struggle evolved, how each generation inherited the ambitions and grievances of the one before, and how nearly 2 centuries of unrest forged identities still recognizable today. What follows is not simply a tale of war. It is the story of how a kingdom fought to define itself in the shadow of an empire. It is the story of how ideas about faith, authority, justice, and national identity can outlive kings and armies. And it is the story of how Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire, bound together by history, spent 186 years learning the cost of that bond. The story of nearly 2 centuries of conflict between Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire begins long before armies marched or reformers preached. It begins in the 12th century, when Europe was still taking shape out of the fragments of older worlds. Power belonged to families rather than nations, and the boundaries of kingdoms were not lines on a map, but understanding's fragile agreements between rulers, nobles, and the church. It was in this world that Bohemia carved out its place, and it was in this world that the empire began watching Bohemia with growing concern. In the 12th century, Bohemia was not yet a kingdom in the strict sense. It was a duchy, ruled by the Přemyslid Familia dynasty, older than many of the imperial houses around it. The Přemyslids claimed descent from a legendary plowman called Přemyslid, a symbol of their connection to the land and the people. Chroniclers of the time describe the early dukes as shrewd, patient, and deeply aware of their precarious position. To the west lay powerful German duchy. To the south and east lay rival Slavic principalities. Bohemia's early dukes understood this reality. They swore oaths when necessary, paid homage at imperial courts, and attended ceremonies that reinforced the emperor's status. Yet they did so with caution, always guarding the autonomy that had made their family strong. Their lands were rich in silver, timber, and trade resources the empire wanted, but resources the Přemyslids were determined to control. As long as the dukes managed their obligations carefully, they could navigate the dangerous waters of imperial politics. But whenever succession disputes arose within Bohemia, the emperor saw an opportunity to intervene, and in the 12th century, succession disputes arose often. Unlike later medieval monarchies, Bohemia did not follow Instead, the Přemyslid dynasty practiced a form of seniority, where rule passed to the eldest male of the clan. In theory, this system preserved unity. In practice, it created rival factions within the family, each branch waiting for its turn, each claiming rights the others might dispute. When a duke died, his brothers, cousins, and nephews often believed they were the rightful heir. Local nobles threw their weight behind different candidates. Priests and bishops offered blessings that aligned with political loyalties. Suddenly, the duchy found itself not as a single entity, but as a fractured house, arguing over who would wear the mantle of leadership. These fractures were precisely the moments the Holy Roman Empire exploited. Every unclear succession became a chance for the emperor to assert his authority. When two Přemyslid claimants fought for control, each would seek imperial recognition, and recognition was never free. It came with conditions: military support, political favors, or outright concessions. The emperor might demand tribute, or control over borderlands, or loyalty in imperial wars. In this way, Bohemia's internal disputes began to translate into imperial influence. Every new duke was expected to affirm his place as a vassal. Every affirmation tightened the emperor's grip. Yet the Přemyslids were not passive. They worked tirelessly to maintain their autonomy. Many dukes cultivated strong ties with local nobles, strengthening the internal unity of the duchy. Others invested in fortifications, towns, and trade. A Bohemian duke who could command wealth and loyalty at home had far more leverage in negotiations with the emperor. Chroniclers speak of dukes who rode to imperial courts not as supplicants, but as power brokersmen who controlled strategic posses into Eastern Europe. Men whose armies could be decisive in imperial campaigns. The tension that developed was subtle at first. It was a tension of expectations, of pride, of conflicting visions for the future. The empire believed Bohemia owed obedience. Bohemian leaders believed they owed cooperation, but not submission. Between those positions lay the seeds of conflict that would grow over the next century. One of the defining moments of this early tension came during the reign of Duke Vladislas II. He ruled during the mid-12th century, a time when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sought to strengthen imperial authority across all his realms. Barbarossa admired loyalty and rewarded it generously. He punished defiance just as fiercely. Vladislas recognized the danger and the opportunity. By supporting Barbarossa's military campaigns in Italy and Germany, he secured privileges that elevated Bohemia's status. In 1158, the emperor granted Vladislas the title of Kinga, monumental victory for Bohemian prestige, but the title was not hereditary. It applied only to Vladislas himself. This was a calculated move by the empire. On one hand, it honored the Přemyslids. On the other, it ensured future Bohemian leaders would remain dependent on imperial goodwill. After Vladislas's death, the kingly title vanished, replaced once more by the older ducal rank. Bohemians celebrated their king, but they also saw how fragile royal authority could be when it depended on the emperor's approval. The return to ducal status ignited more succession disputes. Each claimant to the Bohemian throne now had two options: rally support among local nobles or seek recognition from the emperor. The most ambitious chose both. Imperial favor became a decisive factor, and the emperor used it skillfully to bring Bohemia closer under his authority. The Přemyslids, once united by lineage, became increasingly divided by politics. By the late 12th century, Bohemia's internal and external pressures were beginning to merge. Emperor Henry VI attempted to strengthen imperial control over Central Europe, and Bohemia found itself entangled in these broader ambitions. Henry demanded military support. He demanded loyal attendance at imperial diets. He expected the Bohemian Duke to aid in enforcing imperial decisions across neighboring lands. Each demand seemed modest on its own, but together they formed a growing chain of obligations. Not all Bohemians accepted this. The Přemyslid Duke Ottokar, the first, emerged as one of the strongest challengers to imperial influence. He understood the shifting political landscape after Henry VI's death, when the empire plunged into civil war between rival claims. Ottokar used this moment of imperial weakness to assert greater independence. By switching allegiances at key moments and negotiating directly with factions within the empire, he secured formal recognition of hereditary kingship in 1198. This was not temporary. It was not personal. It was for the Přemyslid line itself. With this, a turning point arrived. Bohemia was now officially a kingdom, not a duchy. Its ruler was not a mere participant in imperial politics, but an elector, the man responsible for choosing the emperor. For the first time, Bohemia stood almost as an equal to the German princes, who dominated imperial governance. But this elevation brought new risks. Hereditary kingship strengthened Bohemia at home, but it made the empire even more determined to assert authority. The emperor now expected more from Bohemia, not less. A king could not behave like an ordinary vassal, and the king of Bohemia was now expected to demonstrate loyalty that matched his elevated rank. Thus, as the 12th century drew to a close, the foundations of the 186-year conflict were firmly set. Bohemia had risen from a powerful duchy to an autonomous kingdom. The Přemyslid dynasty had grown more confident, more ambitious, and more determined to protect its sovereignty. Meanwhile, the empire viewed Bohemia's growing independence as a challenge to imperial order. The relationship, once manageable through diplomacy, payments, and careful symbolic gestures, began to develop sharper edges. Succession would remain a source of turmoil. Imperial expectations would continue to weigh heavily, and Bohemia's determination to guard its autonomy would only grow stronger as it moved into the 13th century. What began as a subtle struggle of influence and recognition in the 12th century would evolve into direct confrontations, dynastic maneuvers, and ideological battles that reshaped Central Europe. The early dukes of the Přemyslid line did not yet know it, but they had set their kingdom on a path toward nearly 2 centuries of tension. War, negotiation, and transformation, an arc that would lead from imperial courts to battlefields. From ecclesiastical councils to the sermons that shook Christendom itself, the first seeds were planted. A proud dynasty, a rising kingdom, an emperor who demanded obedience, and a land determined to remain itself. Nobles gained more influence, forming estates that would become central to Bohemian political life. With prosperity came confidence, and with confidence came identity. Bohemians began to see themselves not simply as a Slavic people under a ruling dynasty, but as subjects of a kingdom with its own destiny. Chronicles written in Latin and Czech began to speak of Terra Bohemiae. The land of Bohemia is something larger than its rulers. Yet it was not simply the ambitions of rulers that shaped relations between Bohemia and the empire. It is important to understand that medieval identity was not nationalism in the modern sense. It was not defined by rigid borders or ideological doctrines. And as the century progressed, the idea that Bohemia had a destiny separate from imperial domination began to feel more natural. This did not yet manifest as rebellion or outright defiance. It existed instead as a quiet confidence, a sense that Bohemia did not need to fear confrontation with the emperor. It was a time when bold men could climb quickly and fall even faster. For Bohemia, this instability was both a curse and an opportunity. Accursed because imperial uncertainty meant unpredictable demands, shifting alliances, and threats pressing from every direction. But also an opportunity because a clever or fearless ruler might seize lands that had once been tightly bound to imperial control. And Ottokar II was nothing if not fearless. Before his rise, the Přemyslid dynasty had already begun lifting Bohemia from a peripheral duchy into a kingdom with growing prestige. Yet it was Ottokar who sensed that the true limit of Bohemia's power was not defined by tradition or imperial decree, but by the capacity of a king to impose his will upon the surrounding lands. He inherited the throne in an unsettled moment, but instead of navigating cautiously, he stepped into the political vacuum with the confidence of someone who believed his destiny extended far beyond Prague. His early campaigns revealed a ruler who understood the fluidity of the era, a man who recognized that the empire's weakness was a ladder waiting to be climbed. His attention first turned southward toward Austria, a region destabilized by the extinction of the Habsburg dynasty, the death of Duke Frederick II. The quarrelsome had left Austria without a clear heir, and Europe without a consensus about who should inherit such a strategically vital territory. To the west lay Bavaria, to the south the Alpine passages into Italy, to the east the Hungarian frontier. Austria was not simply a duke, it was a geographical hinge, a crossroads of trade, diplomacy, and military movement. Whoever controlled it would gain immense leverage over Central Europe. Ottokar, recognizing this, moved decisively. With a combination of marital diplomacy, military intervention, and opportunistic timing, he secured Austria under his rule. From the empire's perspective, this was alarming. A Bohemian king now ruled both Bohemia and Austria, a combination of power not seen before. Bohemia had typically been regarded as a valuable but peripheral component of the imperial structure. Now it had become the engine of a new emerging power, one that could challenge traditional centers of influence such as Bavaria, Swabia, and even the imperial court itself. Ottokar's ambitions did not stop there. He expanded into Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, extending his rule down the Adriatic corridor and securing influence over key Alpine regions. Suddenly, the map of the empire showed a massive block of territory under his control, a block that stretched farther, economically and militarily, than many of the empire's old princely houses combined. For a moment, Ottokar II was the unquestioned master of Central Europe. Chroniclers of his time wrote of his splendor, his wealth, and his unmatched armies. Bohemia, which had once been seen as a modest kingdom, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the age. Merchants gravitated toward his realm, nobles sought his favor, and foreign courts treated him as a monarch whose influence extended far beyond the borders of his capital. But every step he took upward pushed the empire closer to confrontation. The Holy Roman Empire may have been weakened, but it still possessed a long memory, and those who guarded its traditions could not ignore a king who seemed to be redrawing its internal map without permission. Ottokar's dramatic rise set in motion a tension that would ultimately define the next stage of Bohemia's relationship with the empire. He had not merely expanded, he had challenged the very structure of the imperial order. The empire expected its princes and kings to gain power through imperial favor, not through independent conquest. Ottokar, however, had rewritten that rule. He acted as if Bohemia's destiny was self-determined, not granted by any emperor, and in a sense, he was right for a brief moment. His strategy worked, but empires rarely tolerate rival centers of gravity, especially ones that rise too quickly. The sudden appearance of a powerful Bohemian Austrian state forced the empire to respond. When the electors gathered to choose a new king of the Romans, their eyes fell on a man who contrasted Ottokar in every way Rudolf of Habsburg. He was from a modest noble line, lacking the prestige of the great houses and posing no immediate threat to the delicate balance of princely power. He seemed safe, manageable, cooperative, but he also had a keen eye for opportunity. And when he became king of the Romans, he recognized immediately that the greatest challenge to imperial authority was not the electors, not the princes, not the church, but Ottokar II. Rudolf made it clear that he intended to restore lands that had been seized without imperial consent. To Ottokar, this was more than a legal dispute. was an existential challenge. He believed he had earned his territories through force, diplomacy, and legitimacy, while Rudolf saw them as stolen pieces of the empire. This disagreement was not about a border or a duchy. It was about two visions of power. One where a king could shape his destiny through bold expansion, and another where the empire remained the final arbiter of authority. The clash that followed felt almost inevitable. Ottokar, confident in his armies and his alliances, refused to submit. Rudolf, seeking to consolidate his throne and restore imperial dignity, refused to yield. Their rivalry was a test of what the empire would be in the future. A fragmented collection of semi-independent princes, or a reasserted imperial authority with real power over its territories. For Bohemia, the stakes were even higher. Ottokar had become more than a king. He had become a symbol of Bohemian independence and ambition, a ruler who dared to imagine a different political reality for his people. The build-up to their conflict revealed the sharp contrast between their strategies. Ottokar relied on the strength of his lands, the loyalty of his nobles, and the prestige of his court. Rudolf relied on legal arguments, alliances with rival princes, and a deliberate framing of Ottokar as a threat to imperial unity. Behind these maneuvers lay a deeper truth. Ottokar's expansion had disrupted the equilibrium of Central Europe, and now the entire region was preparing to choose sides. As the conflict escalated, it became clear that Ottokar's greatest strength, his ambition, was also his greatest vulnerability. His vast territories required constant attention, resources, and loyalty. The kind of loyalty that could shift when political winds changed. Rudolf, meanwhile, slowly consolidated the support of princes who felt overshadowed by Bohemia's growth. The stage was set for a confrontation, not only between two rulers, but between two visions of the medieval world. Ottokar II stood at the height of his power, yet the ground beneath him was beginning to shift. His ambition had redrawn the map, redefined Bohemia's place in the empire, and challenged the authority of a system that had lasted for centuries. But in doing so, he had positioned himself directly in the empire's crosshairs. The tension that began in these years would ultimately unravel his empire in the making, and open a new chapter of conflict between Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire. This is where the real struggle sharpens, where the ambitions of one king ignite a chain of events that would shape nearly 2 centuries of conflict. And it is here that the long Bohemian imperial rivalry steps fully into the world stage, carried forward by a king who dared to reach for more than any Bohemian ruler before him. There are moments in this long 186-year struggle when the rhythm of history seems to pause, draw its breath, and then release a shockwave that reverberates for generations. The year 1278 is one of those moments. It is the moment when Bohemia's greatest king met his end on the fields of Marchfeld, when the dream of a Central European powerhouse under Bohemian leadership shattered, and when the Holy Roman Empire reasserted its authority in the most brutal, unmistakable way possible. It is a turning point not just in the life of Ottokar II, but in the entire relationship between Bohemia and the imperial order. To understand the fall, you must first understand the tension that had been building between Ottokar II and Rudolf of Habsburg. Their rivalry was not inevitable by birth, yet it became inevitable by ambition. Ottokar, master of Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, had grown into a ruler whose influence dwarfed that of the newly elected king of the Romans. Rudolf, meanwhile, was determined to restore lands he believed had been seized without imperial sanction. Their conflict was more than a personal feud, it became a battlefield over the very nature of imperial power. If Ottokar could hold his territories, the empire risked turning into a loose association of princes with no meaningful central authority. If Rudolf prevailed, the imperial crown would prove it still had the strength to shape the political order of Central Europe. The first clash between them, fought more through diplomacy and legal rulings than swords, ended poorly for Ott. He was forced to return Austria and its surrounding territories pending negotiation. But Ottokar was not a man who accepted reticuli. He regrouped. He tightened his alliances, and when Rudolf continued pressing him, Ottokar Ottokar. Ottokar. The stage was set for open war. The armies that gathered in the summer of 1278 represented two very different worlds. On one side stood Ottokar II, proud, experienced, and commanding knights from lands he had spent the last decade unifying. On the other stood Rudolf, a support drawn from princes, eager to prevent Bohemian dominance, reinforced by Hungarian forces led by King Ladislas IV. The battlefield would be the Marchfeld, a broad, open plain near the river unforgiving and perfectly suited for a massive cavalry engagement. It is a landscape that leaves little room for maneuver, a place where strength meets strength in the most direct, decisive way. When the two armies faced each other, witnesses spoke of the glitter of armor stretching across the horizon. Ottokar rode at the head of his forces, wearing a crown not just of gold, but of expectation that he would restore the glory he had lost. Expectation that Bohemia's destiny still lay in his hands. Rudolf, meanwhile, carried the mantle of a ruler fighting to preserve imperial order. In many ways, the entire future of the region was compressed into those two figures, standing on opposite sides of a battlefield that would decide everything. The clash began with the thunder of hooves. Thousands of cavalry charged across the open field, shattering the ground beneath them. Dust rose like smoke from a burning city. The din of steel, striking steel, carried across the plain, and for a moment, Ottokar's forces seemed to gain the upper hand. His knights were disciplined, experienced, and loyal. They pressed forward with the confidence of men who had followed their king into victory time and time again. Yet Rudolf's alliance was larger, and critically, the Hungarian light cavalry provided a kind of mobility Ottokar's heavy knights could not match. The battle raged for hours, a swirling chaos of charges, countercharges, and desperate resistance. Ottokar fought among his men, not behind them. Chroniclers describe him as fearless, urging his forces forward even as the tide began to turn. But slowly, inevitably, his lines began to bend. The flanking attacks from the Hungarians chipped away at his army. Rudolf's knights pressed harder. The cohesion that had defined Ottokar's power began to unravel on the open plain. At some points, stories differ on exactly when the Bohemian forces broke. What followed was not a strategic withdrawal, but a collapse. Men who had fought under Ottokar for years now fled across the field, and in the chaos, the king found himself surrounded. Whether he fell in the heat of battle or was struck down after the fighting subsided remains contested, but the result is unmistakable. Ottokar II, the proud, ambitious king who had nearly reshaped Central Europe, died on the field of Marchfeld. His body, once adorned with symbols of victory, was stripped, looted, and left among the fallen. Only later was it recovered by Rudolf's order, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of political necessity. The moment his life ended, the world he had built began collapsing. For Bohemia, the defeat was more than the death of a king. It was the death of a vision. Ottokar's empire in the making fell apart almost instantly. Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola reverted to imperial control. The Habsburgs, who had been obscure before Rudolf's election, now found themselves holding the very lands that would become the foundation of their future dynasty. In Prague, the situation was grim. Ottokar's son, the young Wenceslas II, was only a child. Bohemia, leaderless and weakened, became exposed to external interference. Rudolf seized the opportunity with characteristic precision. On the surface, he acted as a protector of the boy king. In practice, he ensured that Bohemia would remain closely tied to imperial authority. Imperial administrators and foreign nobles gained influence at the Bohemian court. Local magnates began maneuvering for advantage, each seeking to control the kingdom during the minority of when the stability that Ottokar had worked so hard to impose evaporated almost overnight. This imperial involvement was not merely political, it was psychological. The Bohemian nobility, who had once marched across Europe under a king who seemed unstoppable, now faced an empire ready to remind them of their place. The humiliation of Marchfeld echoed through every decision, every negotiation. The memory of Ottokar's shattered ambitions became a warning etched into the identity of the kingdom. It is during these years that Bohemia learned a painful truth. It was strong enough to challenge the empire, but not strong enough to defeat it outright. Yet Bohemia did not collapse, even weaken it. Even overshadowed, the kingdom endured. Wenceslas II would eventually grow into a capable ruler, one who restored much of Bohemia's strength. But the scars of 1278 never fully healed. The death of Ottokar II marked a turning point in the long struggle moment, when the empire reaffirmed its dominance and Bohemia was forced to navigate its future with caution, memory, and buried resentment. The Battle of Marchfeld is not merely a military event. It is the pivot upon which the next century of conflict turns. It represents the empire's decisive rejection of Bohemian overreach, the beginning of Habsburg Ascendancy, and the first major fracture in a relationship that would break open again during the Hussite era. The fall of Ottokar II did not end Bohemia's ambitions, but it reshaped them. It did not crush Bohemian identity, but it hardened it, and it did not silence Bohemia's resistance. It only pushed it into new forms, new eras, and new conflicts. The plains of Marchfeld hold a memory of a king who reached too far in a kingdom that would spend generations grappling with the consequences. And from this turning point, the long 186-year struggle moves into its next phase, one defined by recovery, resurgence, and the slow rebuilding of strength under Wenceslas II. In the generations of this long conflict between Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire, the pendulum of history rarely stayed still. After the devastation of Marchfeld in 1278, many believed Bohemia would fade into the shadow of imperial control, reduced to a cautionary tale about challenging the crown. Yet history often defies expectation, and it was under the young Wenceslas, the second son of the fallen Ottokar, Bohemia not only recovered but rose into a position of influence. Neither the empire nor the surrounding kingdoms could ignore. Bohemia had been humbled, but it had not been broken. The kingdom possessed resources, geography, and a resilient nobility. What it lacked was time and leadership. And so he imposed direct royal oversight, limiting the influence of local nobles and ensuring that profits flowed toward the monarchy. This was a strategic move, one echoing the methods of stronger centralized kingdoms, like France. By tying wealth directly to the crown, Wenceslas strengthened the institution his father had left vulnerable. With silver, he purchased stability. With silver, he purchased loyalty. With silver, he rebuilt Bohemia's prestige. Introduced in the early 1300s, the groschen became one of Europe's most respected and stable coins. Its consistent weight and purity allowed merchants to trust it across long distances. That trust translated into influence. A kingdom whose currency shaped commerce was a kingdom that could not be ignored. It is here that Bohemia's story departs from simple recovery and enters the realm of transformation. Wenceslas was careful. He did not repeat his father's open defiance, but he was also deliberate. He negotiated from a position of wealth. He positioned himself among the empire's princes as a ruler whose voice mattered. Silver had given him what armies could not. Leverage. The relationship between Bohemia and the imperial court during his rule became defined by this careful dance. Wenceslas maintained loyalty when necessary, especially in matters of ceremony and formal obligation. But behind the scenes, he used his resources to extend influence into Poland, Hungary, and beyond. The Přemyslid dynasty, once shaken by defeat, now projected confidence rooted not in battlefield victories, but in economic ascendancy. As silver poured from Kutná-Hora, Prague itself transformed. The city swelled with merchants, craftsmen, and miners seeking opportunity. Markets expanded. Roads improved. New trade connections. Nonetheless, during his lifetime, Wenceslas II achieved a remarkable feat. He restored Bohemia's dignity and influence after one of the most devastating defeats in its history, where Ottokar II had reached too far too fast. Wenceslas built slowly, carefully, allowing wealth to do the work that swords once had. And yet, the Empire watched. The princes watched. The Habsburgs, newly risen, watched. The question was not whether Bohemia was strong. Evidence lay in every Pragegroschen minted, but whether this strength would endure beyond the life of the king who shepherded it. In the larger arc of the 186-year conflict, the reign of Wenceslas II represents the calm before a storm. It is a period of prosperity that sets the stage for future upheaval. For Bohemia's wealth would become both a blessing and a curse. It would allow the kingdom to assert itself, but it would also make it a target. And the currents of religious reform, social tension, and dynastic uncertainty were already beginning to stir beneath the surface. But the forces that would define the next chapter is the collapse of the Přemyslid line, the rise of new dynasties. The spiritual unrest that would ignite a century later were already gathering momentum. Wenceslas E.S. legacy was strength, but strength alone could not shield Bohemia from the storms ahead. There are moments in history when a kingdom as fate turns not through grand battles or sweeping reforms, but in the quiet, brutal instant when a single life ends. For Bohemia, that moment came in 1306. With the murder of Wenceslas III, the last male heir of the Přemyslid dynasty, it was a death without witnesses, without warning, and without a clear culprit. And yet its consequences would ripple outward, pulling Bohemia into a succession crisis that opened the door to imperial interference, foreign ambition, and internal fracture. The kingdom that had risen through silver and statecraft now faced a void that no wealth could fill. Wenceslas III was young, energetic, and inexperienced, standing in the long shadow of his father, where Wenceslas II had ruled through economic vision and cautious diplomacy. His son inherited too much responsibility, too soon, and too dangerous an age. He carried multiple crowns: Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, at least in Tietlandese. Claims drew rivals like wolves. His rule had barely begun when the pressures of maintaining these overlapping realms began to pull him in too many directions. The Polish nobility resisted his authority. His Hungarian title was more symbolic than real. And in Bohemia itself, the nobles who had flourished under his father's stability now sought to expand their influence under a less dominant monarch. In the summer of 1306, Wenceslas set out to reassert his authority in Poland. He traveled to the city of Olomouc, planning to muster forces and continue his campaign. It was here, on August 4th, that his life was cut short. The chronicles say he was found in his lodging, stabbed to death. No one heard the killer. No one reported a struggle. No one was ever punished. It was a murder executed with chilling precision, and the silence that followed tells its own story. There were many who stood to benefit from the young king's death. Poland's rival claimants, Hungarian magnates, even Bohemian nobles, frustrated by royal oversight. And overshadowing all of this was the quiet but unmistakable interest of the Holy Roman Empire, whose leaders had no desire to see Bohemia controlling multiple crowns. Whether the killer acted alone or at the behest of powerful backers, the result was undeniable. The Přemyslid dynasty, which had ruled Bohemia for 4 centuries, was extinguished in the male line. With Wenceslas III's death, the kingdom was left without a clear heir. This sudden vacuum created a wave of uncertainty that spread through the countryside, the nobility, and the royal court. A kingdom built on the stability of hereditary continuity now found itself exposed, its wealth coveted, its lands vulnerable, its future uncertain. The Bohemian nobility, once cohesive under strong kings, quickly fractured. Their unity had always been tied to royal authority. Without it, ambitious nobles began maneuvering to shape the succession. Some advocated for internal candidates, noble families with distant ties to the Přemyslids through marriage. Others argued for foreign princes who could bring alliances or military protection, and while these debates simmered, the empire watching from beyond Bohemia's borders saw an opportunity. The Holy Roman Empire had long maintained a complicated relationship with Bohemia. It depended on Bohemia's vote in imperial elections. It relied on Bohemian resources in the eastern reaches of the empire. Yet it resented and feared Bohemia's periodic attempts to act independently. The collapse of the dynasty offered a moment to reclaim influence. If the empire played its hand carefully, it could shape Bohemia's next king, ensuring the kingdom remained bound to imperial interests. The leading candidate from the empire's perspective was a familiar figure, Rudolf of Habsburg's son, Albert I. The Habsburgs had gained Austria after Ottokar II's fall. Now they sought to extend their influence further north. Albert did not claim the throne for himself, but he made clear that the empire had a role to play in selecting Bohemia's next ruler. In doing so, he invoked imperial authority not as a blunt weapon, but as a political tool. The empire would not impose a king outright, it would legitimize one, and legitimacy was something Bohemia desperately needed. Yet Bohemia's nobles were not passive. They understood the danger of allowing the empire to dictate their succession. To do so would mean trading independence for stability. And while some were comfortable with that compromise, others resisted fiercely. The kingdom's wealth made it too valuable to surrender to imperial oversight. Their first choice for a successor was Wenceslas's sister, Anne of Bohemia, and her husband, Henry of Carinthia, through Anne. The Přemyslid bloodline, though female, could be preserved. Henry was a mild ruler, lacking a strong military base, and that made him acceptable to factions within the Bohemian nobility, who preferred a weak king they could control. But Henry's lack of force also made him vulnerable. His authority was shallow. He could not command the respect that Bohemia needed in a moment of crisis. The empire wasted little time exploiting this weakness. Albert I rejected Henry's legitimacy. He declared the Bohemian throne vacant, asserting the empire's right to intervene. The nobles were now caught in a dangerous contest between internal factions and imperial pressure. The king's seat became a prize drawing foreign claimant, Austrian, Bavarian, even French. At the same time, rival noble houses within Bohemia waged political war, forming alliances and counter-alliances in an attempt to shape the future. What emerged was not merely a succession crisis, but a structural crisis. For centuries, the Přemyslid dynasty had provided a centralizing force. Now, without that anchor, the kingdom's unity cracked. The powerful Rosenborg family pushed one agenda. Other nobles, enriched by silver and emboldened by the absence of a strong monarch, sought greater autonomy. Some saw profit in aligning with Austria. Others feared Habsburg domination more than internal disputes. Throughout this period, Bohemia's people experienced a different kind of uncertainty than war. The fields were still tended. Markets still bustled, but the sense that the kingdom's identity was shifting from something rooted in ancient lineage to something being negotiated in foreign courts created an atmosphere of anxiety. When a kingdom loses its dynasty, it loses more than its lineage. It loses its memory of stability. By 1307, the situation had deteriorated to the point that Henry of Carinthia was effectively overthrown by a coalition of nobles seeking imperial protection. Albert I responded by pushing his son, Rudolf III, as a candidate for the Bohemian throne. This sparked outrage among nobles who feared becoming mere subjects of Habsburg expansion. Yet the political landscape was so fractured that resistance lacked cohesion. Some nobles supported Rudolf in exchange for imperial favor. Others rejected him with equal passion. Rudolf's reign, brief and contested, symbolized the deeper problem. Bohemia could not govern itself effectively without a dynastic core, and the empire knew it. Whether through military pressure or political maneuvering, imperial influence seeped deeper into the kingdom. Even after Rudolf's early death, Albert I continued applying pressure. His assassination in 1308 disrupted his plans, but did not weaken the idea that Bohemia was now a kingdom whose future would be shaped as much in imperial elections as in its own courts. The collapse of the Přemyslids did more than destabilize the crown. It created a long-term vulnerability that would play out over decades. Without a strong hereditary line, the kingdom became dependent on foreign marriages and external alliances. Claims to the throne became political weapons in the hands of regional powers, and every decision from choosing a king to managing the means became entangled in broader struggles across the empire. Yet out of this chaos emerged a lesson that would shape Bohemia's next generations. The kingdom's autonomy could not be taken for granted. It had to be protected not only through arms, but through unity, strategy, and an understanding that foreign claimants would always circle when dynastic weakness appeared. The fall of the Přemyslid dynasty marked the end of one era and the uneasy beginning of another. Bohemia would eventually find stability, but not before enduring years of contested crowns, noble factions, and imperial pressure. And in that struggle, the kingdom would learn that survival required more than wealth or tradition. It required a new kind of resilience, forged in the crucible of uncertainty. In the wake of the Přemyslid collapse, Bohemia faced a crucial decision: how to secure a monarchy that could defend the kingdom's independence, maintain internal order, and navigate the ever-watchful gaze of the Holy Roman Empire. The choice fell upon a man far from Bohemian soil: John of Luxembourg, born in 1296 as the son of Henry VII, Count of Luxembourg. John arrived in Prague not as a local prince, but as a foreign-born ruler whose authority would have to be forged in the crucible of Bohemian politics. His ascension in 1310 marked the beginning of the Luxembourg Dynasty family, whose name would be intertwined with both the rise and recurring tensions of Bohemia within the empire. John's early years as king were defined by a delicate balance between legitimacy and force. Unlike the Přemyslids, whose lineage tied them directly to the kingdom's past glories, John had to earn the loyalty of a nobility that was divided, ambitious, and wary of outside influence. The silver mines at Kutna remained central to Bohemia's wealth, but their governance was now a point of negotiation between crown and aristocracy. John quickly learned that Bohemian kingship required more than ceremonial presence. It required skillful diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances, and, when necessary, military action. John's marriage to Elizabeth of Bohemia, the last Přemyslid princess, was a masterstroke of dynastic politics. By marrying Elizabeth, he tied his foreign bloodline to the kingdom's former royal line, lending his rule an aura of continuity that the Bohemian nobles could accept at least formally. This union produced a royal heir, Charles, who would later become one of Bohemia's most consequential kings. But the early years of John's reign were far from secure. Noble families, particularly the Rosenbergs and the House of Hohenberg, wielded immense influence and often challenged royal prerogatives. John had to assert authority carefully, blending coercion with patronage, negotiation with selective force. Despite these internal challenges, John did not shy away from ambition. He saw Bohemia not merely as a defensible kingdom, but as a platform for broader influence in Central Europe. He pursued military campaigns to secure his borders and assert the kingdom's standing. Against Austria and the surrounding territories, John sought to uphold Bohemian claims and protect the integrity of his realm. Yet his foreign origin complicated matters. While he could command loyalty through royal authority and wealth, he lacked the deep-rooted familial networks of native Bohemian nobles. This sometimes forced him into compromises, granting privileges to powerful lords in exchange for their support. John's military ventures were as much about prestige as they were about security. He participated in campaigns across the empire, often aligning with other princes to demonstrate his capability and to earn the respect of the imperial court. Yet these adventures were a double-edged sword. While they enhanced his reputation abroad, they occasionally drained resources at home and exposed latent tensions within Bohemia. Nobles who had grown used to asserting power in the absence of a strong king were reluctant to submit fully to a monarch whose legitimacy came partly from foreign birth. In this way, John's reign highlighted the enduring tension between centralized authority and aristocratic privilege, a tension that had defined Bohemia since the fall of Ottokar II and would continue for centuries. The broader context of the empire also shaped John's rule. The Luxembourg Dynasty's rise coincided with a period of relative consolidation in the Holy Roman Empire under the Luxembourg family itself. John's father, Henry VII, had become king of the Romans and later Holy Roman Emperor. This connection provided John with diplomatic leverage, yet it also entangled Bohemia in imperial politics. The empire had expectations, loyalty in military campaigns, support for imperial elections, and compliance with laws that reinforced the authority of the emperor. John navigated these demands carefully, harnessing Bohemia's wealth and strategic position to maintain a degree of autonomy, while avoiding open confrontation with the imperial court. One of the most notable aspects of John's reign was his approach to integrating Bohemia into European political networks. Through marriage, alliances, and diplomacy, he connected the kingdom to France, Hungary, and the empire's central powers. His court in Prague became a center of culture and administration, reflecting both local traditions and the broader influence of continental Europe. Yet this cosmopolitanism also generated friction. Local nobles often viewed John's reliance on foreign advisors and connections with suspicion, interpreting it as a threat to their historical influence. Maintaining authority required constant negotiation, careful surveillance of noble ambitions, and occasionally decisive action to suppress dissent. John's reign also planted the seeds for future conflict, particularly along religious and social lines. While the kingdom was outwardly stable, tensions were brewing beneath the surface. Economic growth continued, fueled by silver from Kutna and by trade across the empire. This prosperity enriched nobles and merchants, creating new social dynamics and expectations of political participation. At the same time, the crown's attempts to centralize authority met resistance from those who saw their power as rooted in tradition rather than royal decree. In this way, Jan's monarchy became a crucible for the evolving relationship between ruler and ruled dynamic that would reach its most dramatic expression during the Hussite era. Despite these challenges, Jan's leadership left an enduring mark. He strengthened the institutional foundations of Bohemia, ensuring that even during periods of instability, the kingdom could function effectively. He established legal frameworks that regulated noble privileges, trade, and taxation. He reinforced the monarchy's claim over strategic territories and resources, and he cultivated a court culture that would influence Bohemian identity for generations. While he may not have wielded the personal charisma or military genius of Ottokar II, Jan demonstrated the subtle power of governance, diplomacy, and strategic marriages in securing a kingdom's long-term position within the empire. Jan of Luxembourg's reign also introduced a critical shift in the perception of monarchy itself. Whereas previous kings had relied heavily on personal military prowess and the aura of dynastic legitimacy, Jan showed that power could also be exercised through networks, alliances, and the careful management of wealth. In doing so, he created a model of rulership that balanced Bohemian identity with imperial expectations, a delicate equilibrium that required constant attention, negotiation, and occasional compromise, yet the strains beneath the surface never fully dissipated. Foreign-born monarchs, by their nature, must continually prove their legitimacy, and Jan's reliance on his imperial connections was a reminder to the Bohemian nobility that ultimate authority could always come from outside. The tension between internal autonomy and external expectation remained a persistent feature of Bohemian politics, shaping decisions, alliances, and even conflicts for decades. Jan's reign, therefore, was both a stabilization of the kingdom and a foreshadowing of the struggles to come, a period in which Bohemia learned to balance its wealth, its strategic position, and its independence against the omnipresent shadow of the empire. By the time Jan's reign drew to a close, Bohemia had regained much of its stability and influence. The kingdom was wealthy, strategically positioned, and increasingly integrated into European political networks. Yet the underlying tension between crown and nobility, between domestic autonomy and imperial expectation, remained unresolved. These unresolved tensions would later erupt in crises that defined the trajectory of Bohemia for the next century. Jan's rule, therefore, must be seen as both a consolidation and a prelude to a period of careful reconstruction. Following dynastic collapse, laying the foundation for the Luxembourg dynasty's long and complex relationship with both its own nobles and the empire. In the narrative of Bohemia's long conflict with the Holy Roman Empire, Jan of Luxembourg represents a pivotal transition. He is the foreign-born monarch who inherited a kingdom weakened by dynastic collapse, yet he managed to stabilize it through diplomacy, wealth management, and strategic alliances. His reign set the stage for future expansion under his son Charles, for cultural and political development, and for the continuing tension between the aspirations of Bohemian kings and the expectations of the empire. The Luxembourg dynasty had begun, and with it, a new chapter in Bohemia's enduring story, a chapter marked by foreign blood, internal negotiation, and the constant push and pull between autonomy and imperial authority. The ascension of Charles IV marked a turning point, not just for Bohemia, but for the Holy Roman Empire as a whole. Son of Jan of Luxembourg and Elizabeth of Bohemia, he inherited a kingdom stabilized by his father, yet still bearing the scars of dynastic collapse and noble unrest. Born in 1316, Charles was raised at the French court, steeped in the culture, diplomacy, and sophistication of Europe's most advanced kingdoms. He returned to Bohemia not merely as a ruler, but as a prince with a visioned one that would intertwine Bohemian identity with imperial authority in ways unprecedented in the history of the kingdom. From the outset, Charles displayed a remarkable aptitude for governance. Unlike many kings whose authority depended on force or noble patronage alone, he relied on intellect, negotiation, and law. He understood that Bohemia's strength lay not only in wealth, but in legitimacy, and he worked tirelessly to solidify his authority both within the kingdom and across the empire. His reign would become a model of Renaissance-style statecraft, long before the Renaissance itself had fully arrived in Central Europe. One of Charles's earliest and most enduring achievements was the transformation of Prague into the heart of political, cultural, and religious life in Bohemia. The city, long a regional center of trade and mining, was elevated under Charles into a capital of imperial significance. He commissioned the construction of the new town, expanded fortifications, and developed Prague Castle as both a royal residence and a symbol of dynastic continuity. He invited scholars, architects, and artists from across Europe, cultivating a court that radiated sophistication, learning, and cosmopolitanism. In doing so, Charles not only enhanced Bohemia's prestige, but also created a tangible sense of national identity, anchored in the city itself, a center of authority, both secular and spiritual. Charles's influence, however, extended far beyond Bohemian borders. In 1346, he was elected King of the Romans, and in 1355, he became Holy Roman Emperor. Holding these dual roles allowed him to integrate Bohemia into the empire in unprecedented ways. He was not merely a regional king obeying imperial authority. He was the imperial authority, yet he wielded this power judiciously, understanding that the empire's cohesion depended on balancing the interests of princes, electors, and kingdoms. Charles sought to codify imperial governance, to stabilize succession, and to formalize the election of future emperors. His solution was the Golden Bull of 1356, a document that would define the structure of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. The Golden Bull established the 7 prince-elect, including the King of Bohemia, as the prominent voices in imperial elections. This recognition elevated the Bohemian crown, giving it unparalleled influence over imperial affairs. No longer merely a vassal kingdom, Bohemia became a critical pillar in the empire's political architecture. Yet this power came with responsibility. Charles understood that authority in the empire required compromise, and he spent decades cultivating relationships with rival princes, negotiating boundaries, and ensuring that Bohemia's interests were both respected and reinforced. His reign was a masterclass in political balances, yet diplomatic, ambitious, yet methodical. Despite this apparent stability, tension simmered beneath the surface. Charles's ability to control nobles rested on his personal authority and the legitimacy of his imperial office. While Bohemian aristocrats were willing to accept his vision, the memory of past conflicts lingered. The Rosenbergs, Tepern, Tegens, and other magnate families had grown accustomed to negotiating power in the absence of strong kings. Even as Charles centralized authority, he had to contend with traditions of noble autonomy, ensuring that reforms were gradual and palatable. His success lay in blending pragmatism with ambition. He reformed administration, strengthened royal finances, and codified laws in ways that reduced conflict without provoking outright rebellion. Charles's reign also sowed the seeds for future crises, particularly in the religious sphere. The centralization of authority, coupled with the burgeoning intellectual and cultural life in Prague, created fertile ground for reformist ideas. Scholars and clerics questioned tradition, debated theology, and sought new ways to reconcile faith with reason. These currents, though largely invisible during Charles's lifetime, would later erupt in the Hussite movement, a revolution that would transform Bohemia and challenge the empire in ways Charles himself could never have anticipated. In Tis, Sensei Charles's golden era was both a pinnacle of achievement and a precursor to turbulence, a period of consolidation that laid the groundwork for spiritual and political upheaval. Economically, Charles continued the policies that had strengthened Bohemia under Wenceslas II. The silver mines of Kutna. Horo remained central to his strategy, providing the revenue necessary to support both domestic reforms and imperial obligations. Charles invested in infrastructure, urban development, and trade networks that extended Bohemia's influence across Central Europe. Prague became a hub not only of politics and religion, but of commerce, education, and culture, a city that embodied both the wealth and sophistication of the kingdom. Yet even as Charles built this lasting legacy, he was keenly aware of the fragility of power. A kingdom's strength could not rest on gold, architecture, or intellectual achievement alone. It required loyalty, obedience, and perception. Charles was meticulous in cultivating the allegiance of key nobles, the clergy, and foreign allies. He married strategically, arranged alliances, and ensured that Bohemia remained central to imperial decisions. His skill lay in understanding the long game. A kingdom could flourish under the right ruler, but without foresight, even the wealthiest and most powerful realms could collapse. By the end of his reign in 1378, Charles had reshaped Bohemia into a kingdom of unprecedented prestige. Its capital was a cultural and political center. Its rulers held influence across the empire, and its identity as a kingdom both independent and integral to the Holy Roman Empire was firmly established. Yet the foundations of his achievements also contained inherent risks. The concentration of power in the crown, reliance on imperial connections, and the growing prominence of Prague created tensions between city and countryside, crown and nobility, tradition and innovation. These tensions would not explode immediately, but they were the undercurrents of the next century of conflict. Charles IV remains one of the most celebrated figures in Bohemian history, not simply for his personal achievements, but for the way he redefined kingship. Under his guidance, Bohemia became both a jewel of Central Europe and a crucial pillar of the empire. He demonstrated that authority could be exercised not only through force or lineage, but through intellect, strategy, and vision. Yet his reign also serves as a reminder that even the most golden eras are fragile. For beneath the splendor of Prague and the elegance of imperial law, the forces of social, religious, and political upheaval continue to gather, ready to test the kingdom's resilience in the decades to come. The era of Charles IV represents a rare combination of stability, prosperity, and prestige. It is a moment when Bohemia, long a contested and vulnerable kingdom, commanded respect and influence on the European stage. Yet the stage itself for up in the late medieval period was filled with actors ready to challenge, rival, or exploit any perceived weakness. And so, even in triumph, the seeds of the next conflicts were already present, waiting to emerge when the dynasty, the nobles, and the empire would once again confront the delicate balance of power. The death of Charles IV in 1378 marked the end of an era. For nearly half a century, Bohemia had thrived under a ruler whose vision, diplomacy, and wisdom had elevated the kingdom to unprecedented heights. Prague was a center of learning, culture, and imperial influence. The monarchy was respected, and the Golden Bowl of 1356 had secured Bohemia's position within the empire. Yet even the most brilliant reigns leave legacies that are fragile when successors lack the same capacity. The generations that followed Charles IV were marked by struggle, uncertainty, and the gradual erosion of royal authority that would set the stage for decades of tension, rebellion, and war. Charles's son, Wenceslaus IV, inherited not only the crown of Bohemia, but also the crown of the Romanza title that brought prestige but little stability. Wenceslaus was young, inexperienced, and temperamentally unsuited to the delicate balancing act required of a Bohemian monarch. While Charles had ruled with careful negotiation, intellect, and foresight, Wenceslaus relied increasingly on impulse, favor, and a sense of personal entitlement. The nobles, who had grown accustomed to the centralized authority of Charles, quickly detected weakness where Charles had governed through law and culture. Wenceslas's erratic behavior and inconsistent attention to governance encouraged aristocratic ambition and factionalism. Weakening Bohemia, powerful families such as the Rosenbergs, Tepern, Tegens, and other magnates began to assert themselves more openly. The crown's authority, long reinforced by Charles's personal prestige, was now subject to negotiation, coercion, and occasionally outright defiance. Nobles seized judicial authority in their regions, manipulated taxation, and even conducted private feuds with rival families under the guise of autonomy. Wenceslas's attempts to mediate these disputes often failed, either because of his indecision or because the nobles' ambitions had grown beyond his control. Bohemia, for the first time in decades, felt the tension between crown and aristocracy acutely. Simultaneously, the broader political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire shifted in ways that undermined Bohemian authority. The empire, though still formally governed by the structure Charles IV had reinforced, experienced renewed factionalism and instability. Imperial elections became arenas of rivalry between the great houses, and Bohemia's influence, so carefully cultivated under Charles, was challenged. Wenceslas, lacking the diplomatic skill of his father, struggled to assert authority over these proceedings. The kingdom, once a linchpin of imperial governance, now found itself vulnerable to both external pressure and internal dissatisfaction. Economic pressures compounded these political difficulties, while the silver mines of Kutna-Hora continued to produce wealth. Their profitability fluctuated with markets, labor disputes, and infrastructure challenges. The very wealth that had been a source of Bohemia's power under Wenceslas II and Charles IV now became a point of contention. As nobles and city authorities negotiated rights to revenues, privileges, and taxation, the monarchies' declining control over these resources signaled a slow erosion of practical power that would have long-term consequences. Religious tensions also began to surface in this period. Bohemia had long been a kingdom of diverse spiritual practice, but the centralization under Charles IV had maintained a relatively cohesive religious landscape. Wenceslas's reign, by contrast, coincided with the spread of critical theological ideas and a growing dissatisfaction among certain clerical and lay communities. Questions of corruption, ecclesiastical privilege, and reform began circulating, initially among scholars and clergy, but increasingly reaching urban populations. These ideas would later crystallize in movements that challenged both royal and ecclesiastical authority, but their earliest stirrings can be traced to the weakening leadership of this post-Charles period. The combination of weak royal leadership, restless nobility, economic fluctuation, and religious questioning created a volatile environment. Wenceslas's inability to command respect consistently meant that every crisis, whether financial, legal, or political, became a potential flashpoint. The kingdom's unity, so carefully preserved under Charles, was unraveling in subtle but undeniable ways. The vacuum of authority encouraged foreign powers to take notice. Neighboring kingdoms and imperial factions recognized Bohemia's vulnerability and began to maneuver for influence, either through marriage alliances, claims of authority, or military posturing. A critical example of this instability was Wenceslas's fluctuating relations with the empire. He had inherited the title of King of the Romans, yet his incapacity to manage imperial politics effectively weakened Bohemia's leverage. Rival princes encroached on traditional privileges, contested Bohemia's influence in imperial elections, and sought to exploit disputes among Bohemian nobles. Where Charles had used diplomacy and prestige to maintain authority, Wenceslas faced a constant struggle simply to assert basic governance. The kingdom that had once been central to European power dynamics now risked marginalization. Internally, Wenceslas's reign revealed a deeper truth about Bohemian governance. The monarchy's strength had long been tied to the personal skill of the king. Under Charles IV, the institutions he built could function, but they relied on his oversight and credibility. When those qualities were absent in a successor, the structures themselves proved insufficient. Authority became contested, stability fractured, and the kingdom entered a period of what historians later described as pre-Hussite turbulence. A simmering crisis that would ultimately erupt into open conflict in the decades ahead. The erosion of royal authority also manifested in cultural and social arenas. Prague, once a hub of learning and innovation, saw increasing tension between the crown, the city, and the nobility. Across Bohemia, local courts and assemblies grew more assertive, reflecting both frustration and ambition. Its economic base remained significant, and its cultural institutions continued to attract scholars, artisans, and thinkers. The kingdom's central location in Europe ensured that it remained relevant to continental politics, even as its internal cohesion weakened. The paradox of post-Charles Bohemia is striking. A kingdom materially and culturally rich, strategically positioned, yet politically vulnerable because of dynastic and personal failings in leadership. This era also illuminates the recurring pattern in Bohemian history. When royal authority declines, the tension between local autonomy and imperial expectation intensifies. Nobles exploited weakness, foreign powers maneuvered for advantage, and ideological currents gain traction. The stage was set for a transformative period in which religion, politics, and identity would collide. The seeds of the Hussite Wars, which would consume Bohemia in the early 15th century, were sown in these decades of declining authority, unrest, and uncertainty. The kingdom was prosperous, yet restless, wealthy, yet insecure, powerful in theory, yet fragile in practice. By the end of the 14th century, Wenceslaus IV's reign exemplified the limitations of hereditary monarchy without the stabilizing influence of a strong ruler. Bohemia remained a kingdom of significance in Europe, yet it had entered a period of vulnerability unseen during Charles IV's reign. Nobles pressed for influence, cities pushed for privileges, and the monarchies struggled to assert coherence. Imperial politics shifted unpredictably, and religious ideas began to challenge established hierarchies. The stage was set for conflict internal, regional, and eventually continental. In sum, the period after Charles IV demonstrates the fragile balance between prosperity and authority. Bohemia remained wealthy, strategically vital, and culturally sophisticated, but the decline in centralized royal authority created a kingdom increasingly defined by negotiation, contention, and contested loyalties. Economic resources alone could not guarantee political stability. Wealth could enrich, but could not bind loyalty. The contrast between Charles IV's reign and his successors illustrates a fundamental truth of medieval governance. The personal qualities of the ruler could determine the fate of the kingdom, and without those qualities, even the strongest foundations could begin to crumble. As the 14th century drew to a close, Bohemia faced a complex web of challenges. Noble ambitions, imperial expectations, economic pressures, and religious stirrings converged, leaving the kingdom poised on the edge of upheaval. The decline of royal authority was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion, a slow unraveling of the structures and loyalties that Charles IV had carefully maintained. And in this context, the next generation would inherit a kingdom rich in resources and prestige, but fragile in its governance. And the principle that the church should serve its people rather than dominate them. Hus's sermons began modestly, delivered from the pulpits of Prague, yet their clarity, conviction, and moral urgency quickly drew attention. He spoke against corruption, challenging bishops and priests who exploited the faithful for profit. He emphasized the primacy of Scripture, arguing that the Word of God, not human institutions, should guide believers, and he spoke in the vernacular, making his message accessible to ordinary Bohemians. In doing so, Hus connected with a broad audience, from university students to tradesmen, from city dwellers to rural parishioners. His words were not abstract theological debates. They were calls to action, calls to moral accountability, calls for a church that reflected the principles of Christ rather than the interests of the powerful. The reaction from the ecclesiastical hierarchy was swift and severe. Local bishops and church officials saw in Hus not a preacher, but a threat. His critiques challenged centuries of privilege, questioned the legitimacy of authority, and threatened to inspire unrest among ordinary people. They demanded conformity, summoned Hus to answer charges of heresy, and sought to silence his growing influence. Yet each attempt to suppress him only amplified his reputation. Hus's courage, combined with the resonance of his message, earned him admiration and followers across Bohemia. By the first decade of the 15th century, he had become the most prominent figure in a nascent reform movement, representing the aspirations and frustrations of a kingdom ready for change. The popular support Hus garnered reflected deeper social currents. Ordinary Bohemians, already wary of a monarchy, struggling to assert authority, and a nobility asserting its independence, saw in Hus a moral clarity that contrasted sharply with the failures of existing institutions. Townspeople were drawn to his calls for accountability. Peasants resonated with his critiques of ecclesiastical exploitation. The educated classes found in him a voice for reform grounded in reason and principle. Hus's movement was not merely religious, it was deeply intertwined with Bohemian identity, a reflection of a kingdom striving for autonomy in both spiritual and temporal spheres. His rise signaled the emergence of a society increasingly unwilling to accept authority without scrutiny, a society ready to challenge entrenched power structures. The church hierarchy, alarmed by the potential for widespread dissent, intensified its efforts to suppress him, issuing condemnations, threatening excommunication, and appealing to imperial authority. And economic pressures. Religious reform could become a catalyst for broader social and political upheaval. The implications of Hus's rise were profound. By challenging the spiritual authority of the church, he also indirectly questioned the political structures intertwined with ecclesiastical power. In Bohemia, the monarchy, nobility, and clergy had long been linked in a complex web of mutual obligation, patronage, and influence. Hus's critiques threatened to unravel this web, empowering citizens, towns, and reform-minded nobles to assert demands that transcended purely religious concerns. Every sermon, every act of defiance, was a warning that the kingdom's fragile equilibrium was at risk. What had begun as theological debate was fast becoming a moral and social reckoning. Hus's growing prominence coincided with the broader instability in the empire and the waning authority of the Bohemian crown. The monarchy, still grappling with Wenceslas IV's inconsistent leadership, struggled to mediate between nobles, towns, and the church. Economic pressures persisted as fluctuations in trade and the wealth of urban centers created friction between different social strata. Against this backdrop, Hus's reformist message offered clarity, purpose, and a vision of justice, drawing support from those frustrated with the status quo. He became a figure not only of spiritual reform, but of social hope, a symbol of resistance to corruption and mismanagement at every level. Conflict with church authorities escalated steadily. By the early 1400s, Hus faced official charges of heresy and was summoned to councils in Prague and beyond. Each confrontation tested the boundaries of Bohemian autonomy, pitting local support for reform against the authority of the church and the empire. Hus, a steadfast refusal to recant in the face of mounting pressure, demonstrated both his moral conviction and the growing strength of popular support. It became increasingly clear that his ideas were not ephemeral, they were a movement, a challenge to entrenched power, and a precursor to wider unrest that would engulf the kingdom. The rise of Hus also reflected the power of ideas in shaping history. His critiques were grounded in scripture, reason, and a moral philosophy accessible to ordinary people. Unlike abstract or elite scholarship, Hus's message spoke to the lived experience of Bohemians who had endured years of political instability, economic fluctuation, and social inequality. He articulated a vision of authority based on accountability, transparency, and ethical governance principles that resonated beyond religion and touched the very heart of Bohemian identity. Hus's sermons became more than religious discourse. They were an expression of a kingdom's desire for justice, integrity, and self-determination. As Hus's influence expanded, warning signs of a coming storm became impossible to ignore. Tensions between reformers and the church, between nobles and the crown, and between ordinary citizens and authority converged. Bohemia was entering a period in which faith, identity, and politics would collide with unprecedented intensity. Hus's emergence was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of broader pressures that had been building for decades. Yet his personal charisma, intellect, and moral authority amplified these conditions, turning dissatisfaction into a movement. Hussi's voice was both warning and herald. The old order, for all its prestige and authority, could no longer contain the forces gathering within Bohemia. In T's period, the contours of future conflict began to take shape. It demonstrated the power of ideas to mobilize support and challenge entrenched authority, and it highlighted the vulnerability of kingdoms, even wealthy and strategically vital ones. When leadership falters and institutions fail to adapt, Hus's emergence was not merely a religious phenomenon. It was a symptom and a signal of the profound transformation approaching Bohemia, one that would reverberate across Europe for decades. By 1414, Jan Hus had become the most prominent reformer in Bohemia, a figure whose words resonated far beyond the walls of Prague. His challenges to ecclesiastical authority, his calls for moral accountability, and his insistence that scripture held primacy over human hierarchy had made him both celebrated and feared. The church, wary of the growing movement in Bohemia and its potential to destabilize religious and political structures, extended an invitation to Hus to appear at the Council of Constance. For Hus, this was a moment of opportunity, a chance to appeal for reform within the heart of Christendom itself. The journey to Constance was fraught with anticipation and tension. Hus traveled with the expectation that the council, a gathering of Europe's most powerful clerics, theologians, and secular rulers, would listen to reasoned argument and allow debate on matters of doctrine. Bohemian nobles and citizens watched closely, recognizing that Hus's fate would have profound implications for the kingdom. Every step along the Rhine, every city passed, carried with it the weight of expectation, fear, and hope. The safe conduct promised by Emperor Sigismund, intended to protect Hus, cast a shadow of uncertainty. Would the promise be honored? Or was it a ruse in the complex world of imperial politics and ecclesiastical ambition? Upon arrival, Hus found himself in a web of political maneuvering far more intricate than anything he had faced in Bohemia. The council's purpose was to resolve the ongoing western seat, heal divisions within the church, and consolidate authority. Hus's critiques, however, struck at the heart of the hierarchy, challenging not only clerical privilege, but the integrity of the very council convened to restore unity. Leading figures, including influential cardinals and theologians, saw in Hus a dangerous precedent. If one reformer could speak freely, others might follow, and the church's authority could be undermined across Europe. Despite the guarantees of safe conduct, Hus's position was precarious. His writings and sermons were examined, debated, and dissected, Charges of heresy were levied, not simply against his ideas, but against his influence on a kingdom whose allegiance was considered vital to the stability of the empire and the church. Hus, confident in his convictions and committed to moral truth, refused to recant. Each session reinforced the tension between his ethical stance and the political necessity of the council. In Hus's mind, acquiescence would betray both conscience and the Bohemian people, yet his obstinacy placed him in mortal danger. The council's judgment was inevitable. In 1415, Jan Hus was condemned as a heretic. Despite his appeals and the assurances of safe conduct, the decision was enforced with brutal finality. He was burned at the stake on July 6th. His martyrdom was both a personal tragedy and a political act, a demonstration of ecclesiastical power designed to intimidate reformers across Europe. Yet, instead of quelling dissent, the execution inflamed passions in Bohemia and beyond. News of Hus's death traveled swiftly back to Prague and the surrounding countryside. Outrage erupted. For many Bohemians, Hus was not merely a preacher, but a symbol of national pride and spiritual integrity. The kingdom, already restless under weakened royal authority and persistent noble ambitions, found in his execution a flashpoint. Bohemia, caught between imperial expectations and its own identity. Now saw the church not as a distant, benevolent authority, but as an institution capable of imposing power without accountability. Hus, as both reformer and Bohemian, became a symbol of resistance. His death was a reminder that moral courage could challenge entrenched structures, and that ideas, once articulated, could not easily be extinguished by force. Across Bohemia, sermons, writings, and conversations kept his memory alive, spreading his vision and inspiring others to consider the ethical and spiritual reforms he had advocated. The immediate aftermath of the execution was a period of intense social and political turbulence. Urban populations in Prague and other Bohemian cities organized themselves, defending the principles Hus had espoused. Guilds and civic councils took on greater authority, asserting rights and privileges that the monarchy had been unable to enforce consistently. Nobles, some sympathetic to Hus, others opportunistic, began to coalesce around factions aligned with reformist ideals. The kingdom, already weakened by decades of fluctuating royal authority, now faced the destabilizing effect of moral outrage combined with political ambition. The echoes of Jan Hus's execution did not fade quietly into Bohemia's hills and towns. Instead, they grew louder, carried on the lips of priests, scholars, townsfolk, and nobles alike. Across the kingdom, letters and petitions began circulating, carefully worded yet unmistakably firm in their message. Bohemia would no longer accept the imposition of imperial authority without scrutiny. These were not idle complaints, but formal protests, authored by nobles whose families had long shaped the kingdom's politics, asserting that the interests of Bohemia could not be subordinated to distant rulers or clerical authorities. The letters outlined grievances: excessive taxation, the erosion of traditional privileges, interference in local governance, and, most pointedly, the punishment of Hus, a man whom many regarded as a moral exemplar. The tone was measured, but the content was resolute. A challenge had been issued, and Bohemia's patience was exhausted. This period witnessed the rapid growth of Hussite organizations, as local communities sought both spiritual guidance and practical defense. Initially, these groups were informal, gatherings of townspeople and peasants who shared ideas, read sermons, and debated theology. Yet, over time, they became structured communities with clearly defined leadership, shared purpose, and a growing sense of cohesion. Masters, scholars, and local leaders took on roles guiding assemblies. In towns such as Prague, Tabor, and Pilsen, these groups became the nucleus of what would later evolve into organized resistance. Their gatherings were infused with moral urgency. The memory of Hus's martyrdom was a rallying point, a moral compass that guided both discourse and action. The response of the Holy Roman Empire, however, was unrelenting. Letters of protests, petitions, and assemblies were met with increasingly stringent demands. Imperial authorities insisted that Bohemia recognize ecclesiastical decrees, submit to clerical authority, and punish those who challenged the established order. These demands were often backed with threats of military intervention, fines, and sanctions. From the perspective of the empire, Hus's execution was intended to quell unrest, yet it had instead illuminated the depth of Bohemian defiance. Imperial envoys arrived in Prague and other centers, attempting to negotiate compliance, but they were met with a mixture of reasoned argument, moral objection, and, increasingly, outright refusal. As the pressure intensified, the Bohemian response shifted from moral objection to preparation for armed defense. Leaders within Hussite communities and sympathetic nobles recognized that words alone would not suffice. Meetings began to address strategy, logistics, and the organization of militias drawn from towns and villages. Peasants who had previously tilled the land now trained with pikes and crossbows. Craftsmen converted workshops into armories. Local leaders coordinated communication across regions. What had begun as a movement for reform was transforming into a social and military movement, one capable of resisting not only ecclesiastical authority but the might of the Holy Roman Empire itself. The first acts of defiance were both symbolic and strategic. Town councils refused to comply with imperial edicts, openly defying envoys sent to enforce obedience. Nobles who had signed petitions now called for the protection of Hussite communities, providing both resources and sanctuary. These early confrontations were cautious, yet deliberate. Bohemians sought to assert autonomy without immediately provoking overwhelming retaliation. Nevertheless, the message was unmistakable. The kingdom would not simply accept control imposed from outside. The memory of Hus's moral courage empowered citizens to challenge authority in a manner unprecedented in the kingdom as history. Rural communities coordinated with towns to secure routes, protect leaders, and establish lines of communication. Training was decentralized but effective, as local knowledge of the terrain, forests, and rivers became a strategic advantage. Even the nobility, traditionally reluctant to involve themselves in popular movements, found common cause with Hussite forces. The combination of ideological conviction, civic organization, and practical preparedness created a formidable resistance, one that the empire had neither anticipated nor fully understood. The moral and political rhetoric surrounding these early acts of defiance also strengthened Bohemian identity. Hussite leaders framed the struggle not merely as opposition to the church or the empire, but as a defense of the kingdom itself. The memory of Hus became a symbol of collective responsibility, a reminder that moral courage required action. Sermons, pamphlets, and letters circulated widely, reinforcing the principle that the people, united by conscience and shared purpose, had the right to resist unjust authority. This narrative resonated across social strata. Peasants, townspeople, scholars, and nobles alike began to see themselves as participants in a historic struggle for justice, faith, and autonomy. Imperial authorities, however, underestimated the depth of Bohemian resolve. Envoys and emissaries returned to the emperor with reports of organized resistance, moral défiance, and the spread of Hussite ideology. Yet in the early stages, the empire still sought negotiation over confrontation, hoping that threats and diplomacy could restore obedience. The persistence of petitions, assemblies, and armed readiness signaled that Bohemia's defiance was not fleeting but a sustained movement. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, contributed to a growing culture of opposition, one that would soon escalate into open warfare. The first clashes, while minor in scale, were significant in their symbolism. Local militias resisted attempts by imperial forces to enforce decrees. Towns defied ecclesiastical appointments, and nobles protected reformist leaders from arrest. Resistance was not random. It was guided by shared principles, coordinated leadership, and an understanding that the kingdom's survival depended on unity and preparedness. The combination of spiritual conviction and practical organization made the Bohemian response uniquely resilient. This early period of defiance also tested the monarchy's role in Bohemia. Wenceslas IV, still nominally king, found himself caught between imperial expectations, noble ambitions, and popular movements inspired by Hus. His capacity to assert authority was limited, and his responses often reflected indecision or political calculation. Some nobles sought to leverage the king's position, while others bypassed him entirely, aligning directly with Hussite assemblies. In this environment, the monarchy's traditional role as mediator and enforcer was increasingly marginalized, and Bohemia's political landscape became a patchwork of local autonomy, civic initiative, and emerging military organization. By the mid-1410s, it was evident that the kingdom had crossed a threshold. Bohemia was no longer a passive participant in the empire's ecclesiastical and political hierarchy. The combination of organized Hussite groups, noble support, and popular participation created a kingdom capable of sustained resistance. The moral outrage sparked by Hus's execution had been transformed into coordinated action, signaling the first tangible phase of rebellion. This defiance was both reactive, responding to imperial and ecclesiastical pressure, and proactive, asserting a vision of governance, faith, and autonomy that challenged centuries of hierarchical control. The events of this period illustrate the convergence of multiple forces: moral conviction, national identity, political calculation, and military readiness. Bohemia's initial acts of defiance were neither spontaneous nor isolated. They were the product of decades of tension, the decay of royal authority, economic pressures, and the galvanizing influence of Hus's teachings. These early confrontations laid the groundwork for what would become the Hussite Wars, demonstrating how ideas, when paired with organization and determination, could ignite a kingdom into resistance against overwhelming authority. Ultimately, the first phase of Bohemian defiance reveals the complexity of historical causality. It was not merely a religious rebellion, nor simply a political dispute. It was the crystallization of a kingdom's identity, the assertion of collective moral judgment, and the practical organization of a society unwilling to submit to perceived injustice. Armed resistance, moral authority, and popular participation combined to form a movement that would soon challenge both empire and church alike. Bohemia had taken its first decisive step into rebellion. The kingdom, still smarting from Hus's martyrdom, had organized, prepared, and defied. Letters had been written, militias formed, and strategies outlined. The initial sparks of revolt Tugmotest, indicated a larger conflagration was inevitable. From these early acts of defiance, the Hussite movement would grow in scope and intensity, setting the stage for decades of conflict that would shape not only Bohemia but the future of Europe itself. By 1419, Bohemia had reached a boiling point. The kingdom, already simmering with unrest after Jan Hus's execution and the early acts of defiance, now faced direct military intervention. The Holy Roman Empire, unwilling to tolerate a rebellious and reformist Bohemia, sanctioned the first crusades against the kingdom. These were not distant threats or idle warnings. They were armies marching under the banners of imperial and papal authority, charged with the explicit purpose of crushing the Hussite movement, restoring ecclesiastical control, and punishing those who dared to resist. For Bohemia, the arrival of crusading forces marked the transformation of political and moral tension into outright war. The Hussites, however, were not unprepared. Decades of organization, local militias and fortified towns had created a society capable of coordinated defense. They adopted a combination of traditional and innovative military strategies, blending the knowledge of Bohemian terrain with the discipline of organized civic militias. Cities like Prague, Tauber, and Pilsen became centers of resistance, where citizens, tradesmen, and nobles trained together, stockpiled weapons, and developed tactics to counter the bead-equipped crusading armies. Defenses were practical and adaptive. Wagons converted into mobile fortresses, crossbows and pikes supplemented by artillery, and an emphasis on mobility and surprise. The Hussites' defensive approach reflected not only their tactical ingenuity, but also a profound sense of moral purpose. Each confrontation was framed as defense of faith, homeland, and justice, infusing ordinary soldiers with an extraordinary resolve. The kingdom, long fractured by noble disputes and royal weakness, now found a rare unity. Religious conviction, reinforced by Hus's martyrdom, became a unifying force across social and economic divisions. Peasants, artisans, town officials, and sympathetic nobles stood together against a common external threat. This collective resolve was unprecedented in Bohemian history, where political calculations once divided society. Shared purpose now consolidated it. Local communities coordinated with neighboring towns, sharing intelligence, weapons, and supplies. This network of cooperation amplified the kingdom's defensive capacity and underscored the emergence of a uniquely Bohemian identities, one tied to moral conviction, resistance to external authority, and the assertion of self-determination. The first major battles demonstrated both the effectiveness of Hussite organization and the intensity of the crusading effort. In regions surrounding Prague and southern Bohemia, imperial forces launched assaults on towns and fortifications, expecting the familiar advantages of disciplined knights and well-equipped soldiers to overwhelm citizen militia. They were met with unexpected resistance. Hussite forces, using fortified wagon formations and knowledge of terrain, repelled initial attacks with remarkable efficiency. Ambushes along narrow passas, coordinated counterattacks, and strategic use of rivers and forests highlighted the ingenuity of a population fighting for survival and principle. The early successes of Hussite forces shocked imperial commanders and sent ripples through Europe. A kingdom of townspeople and peasants had defied knights and crusaders, altering the perception of what resistance could achieve. These battles were more than military encounters. They were acts of collective defiance and moral statement. Each victory reinforced the legitimacy of the Hussite cause and deepened the psychological resolve of Bohemian society. Towns that had previously been hesitant to openly support reform now took pride in contributing to the defense effort. Pilgrimages and religious observances were intertwined with military preparedness, creating a unique fusion of faith and civic responsibility. The Hussites' ability to frame warfare as both moral and national duty further strengthened the cohesion of the kingdom. Resistance was no longer a matter of survival alone. It became an expression of identity, of ethical and spiritual autonomy, and of a society asserting its right to determine its destiny. The response from the Holy Roman Empire was relentless. Subsequent crusades arrived with greater numbers, broader coalitions, and the explicit backing of papal authority. Knights, mercenaries, and contingents from neighboring territories descended upon Bohemia, seeking to punish, subdue, and dismantle the Hussite movement. Imperial commanders adapted their strategies, attempting to exploit divisions within the kingdom and target towns lacking sufficient fortifications. Yet the Hussites, emboldened by earlier victories, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Coordination between urban centers, rapid mobilization of militias, and innovative tactics allowed them to counter superior forces repeatedly. The result was a series of engagements that, while destructive, reinforced the kingdom's determination to resist domination. The moral dimension of the Hussite Wars played a critical role in sustaining the conflict. Leaders emphasized the righteousness of their cause, invoking the memory of Hus and framing resistance as an act of religious fidelity. Sermons, songs, and chronicles circulated, portraying each confrontation as a defense of God's truth against corrupt authority. Ordinary citizens internalized this narrative, understanding that their participation in military action was both a spiritual and civic duty. The fusion of morality, faith, and defense created a sense of invincibility and purpose, turning the Hussite forces into more than a military entity. They became a moral and social movement with a powerful ideological foundation. Early engagements also revealed the challenges of sustaining a prolonged conflict. Resources were finite. Towns and villages faced the strain of continuous mobilization, and disease and scarcity threatened both soldiers and civilians. Despite these hardships, the Hussites demonstrated remarkable organizational adaptability. Supply lines were improvised, alliances between towns were reinforced, and local leaders emerged as capable commanders and logistics. Communities rotated responsibilities, ensuring that no single town bore the full weight of defense, and maintaining the morale of citizens remained a priority. These practical measures, combined with moral motivation, allowed the Hussites to sustain resistance against a numerically and materially superior enemy. The first major battles also reshaped European perceptions of warfare and resistance. Across the empire, chroniclers and observers marveled at the ability of ordinary citizens to repel professional armies. Reports emphasized the tactical innovations of wagon fortresses, the disciplined use of pikes and crossbows, and the role of collective organization in achieving unexpected victories. The image of Bohemia as a kingdom where moral conviction translated into military effectiveness spread across borders, inspiring debate and speculation about the limits of imperial authority and the potential for popular movements to challenge established power. Bohemia, long considered a peripheral kingdom, had emerged as a central theater of conflict with continental implications. Within Bohemia, the victories and defeats of early engagements solidified the organizational and ideological framework of the Hussite movement. Town councils, guilds, and militias developed protocols for rapid mobilization, communication, and coordination. Leadership structures balanced practical military command with adherence to moral principles, ensuring that the movement remained grounded in the ideals that had inspired it. The Hussite forces were not merely reactive. They began to plan offensives, defend strategic territories, and anticipate imperial campaigns. The kingdom's resilience was both a testament to prior preparation and a reflection of the widespread belief that the struggle was divinely sanctioned. By the end of these early campaigns, it was clear that the Hussite Wars were no longer a series of localized skirmishes. They were a sustained, kingdom-wide struggle, involving the full spectrum of Bohemian society. The integration of faith, moral conviction, military innovation, and civic organization created a model of resistance that would endure for decades. The first battle set the tone for the conflict. Defensive tenacity, ideological clarity, and a willingness to confront overwhelming force. Bohemia had transformed from a reactive kingdom into an assertive polity, determined to maintain its autonomy against the demands of empire and church alike. The Hussite Wars had begun, and the first sparks had ignited a conflagration that would engulf Bohemia for years. What started as moral outrage over the execution of a reformer had evolved into organized resistance, military campaigns, and the assertion of a uniquely Bohemian identity. The kingdoms, towns, nobles, and citizens stood together in defiance, demonstrating that collective conviction, strategic innovation, and moral courage could resist even the most formidable forces. The stage was set for decades of conflict, negotiation, and transformationist struggle that would reshape the kingdom, challenge the Holy Roman Empire, and leave a lasting mark on European history. As the Hussite Wars deepened, one figure emerged from the ranks of Bohemia with a clarity of vision and a genius for innovation that would forever alter the nature of warfare. Jan Žižka. Born in the latter part of the 14th century, Žižka was a nobleman turned military leader whose life had been shaped by personal loss, political turbulence, and the pressing realities of a kingdom under siege. His ascent coincided with the crystallization of the Hussite movement, and his strategies would transform a population of townspeople, peasants, and artisans into a disciplined, highly effective fighting force that confounded Europe's professional armies. Žižka's leadership style was as unusual as it was effective. Unlike the traditional nobility, which often relied on mounted knights and heavily armored troops, he understood that the key to victory lay not in wealth or status, but in organization, discipline, and adaptability. The psychological impact of these victories was as important as the tactical outcomes, instilling confidence within Bohemia, while sowing doubt and fear among imperial forces. Žižka's influence went beyond tactics and strategy. He reshaped the very culture of the Hussite forces. Leadership was decentralized in practice, with local commanders empowered to make decisions within a framework of collective discipline. Soldiers were expected to understand not only their own roles, but the roles of those around them, fostering cooperation and mutual reliance. This approach transformed a disparate population into a cohesive military community, one capable of executing complex maneuvers, sustaining campaigns over months, and responding dynamically to threats. Žižka's army became both a practical instrument of defense and a living embodiment of Hussite ideals. Discipline, moral conviction, and the empowerment of ordinary people. The innovation extended to logistics as well. Žižka understood that mobility was not only a matter of battlefield tactics, but also of supply and communication. The victories achieved under Žižka's command were not isolated. They created momentum that shaped the trajectory of the Hussite Wars. In engagements across southern and central Bohemia, crusading armies found themselves repelled time and again, unable to break through wagon fortifications, counter-coordinated infantry tactics, or anticipate the adaptability of Žižka's maneuvers. Towns that had been on the verge of capitulation stood firm, and the population's confidence in their leaders and in the righteousness of their cause deepened. Bohemia, under Žižka, had become a crucible of innovation, courage, and moral conviction. The kingdom's success was rooted in the fusion of ideology, community, and tactical brilliance, creating a model of resistance that would challenge imperial and ecclesiastical authority across Europe. The transformation of warfare under his command was both immediate and enduring, leaving a legacy that reshaped perceptions of power, strategy, and the potential of ordinary people to influence history. With Žižka at the helm, Bohemia's defiance had become unstoppable, and Europe would take notice. The first waves of crusading forces were met with unexpected ferocity and organization. Ambushes along narrow passes, fortified wagon forts, and coordinated counterattacks repeatedly shattered the invading armies. leaving imperial commanders frustrated and demoralized. The defeats were not isolated incidents, but a series of significant reversals that revealed both the strength of the Hussite forces and the weaknesses of the Crusaders. Horses were trapped in mud or forced into bottlenecks. Knights were harried by massed crossbows, and cannons mounted on wagon forts devastated frontal assaults. Each failure of the Crusaders was a lesson in Bohemian adaptability, and each victory, no matter how small, emboldened the defenders and inspired communities across the kingdom. The psychological impact of these defeats on the crusading forces was profound. Imperial commanders struggled to maintain cohesion among mercenary contingents, knights, and allied forces from neighboring territories. Reports from the battlefield circulated back to the emperor and the papacy, emphasizing not only the tactical brilliance of the Hussites, but also the extraordinary resolve of the Bohemian people. A kingdom that had once been perceived as fractured and vulnerable now presented itself as unified, disciplined, and ideologically committed. Fear began to ripple through Europe, as leaders and chroniclers recognized that this was not merely a series of local skirmishes, it was a sustained, organized, and morally motivated resistance movement, capable of confronting the might of empires. Internal divisions within the Holy Roman Empire compounded the crisis. The succession of crusades exposed fractures among nobles, princes, and regional commanders, many of whom held competing priorities, loyalties, and rivalries. Diplomatic correspondence reflected concern and caution, with leaders debating whether military intervention was worth the risk. By the late 1420s, the Hussite Civil War had reached a critical stage. Both factions had solidified power bases, tested the limits of their strategies, and confronted the consequences of prolonged conflict. Bohemia was exhausted, yet unbroken, caught in the paradox of internal division and enduring strength. The Civil War had transformed the Hussite movement from a unified rebellion into a complex political, religious, and military ecosystem, capable of sustaining itself, even amid ideological discord. The lessons of this internal conflict would resonate beyond Bohemia. Across Europe, rulers and chroniclers recognized that revolutionary movements could be as dangerous to themselves as to their enemies. Taborites and Utraquists would continue to clash, test alliances, and navigate the tensions between principle and pragmatism. Yet the kingdom, forged in decades of external and internal conflict, remained a singular force, a society capable of extraordinary adaptation, moral conviction, and military innovation. The Hussite Civil War, with all its violence, debate, and uncertainty, was both a crucible and a testament to the enduring strength of Bohemia. Generations had grown up under the shadow of constant conflict. These talks, held in Basel, beginning in 1433, sought to reconcile religious dissent with imperial authority and to define the limits of Hussite autonomy. The compacts represented a remarkable achievement in diplomacy for a kingdom that had spent decades fighting for survival. The compact's enforcement, however, posed ongoing challenges. The peace also carried symbolic weight. For Bohemians, it was a formal acknowledgement of their resilience, ingenuity, and moral conviction. The kingdom had resisted crusading forces, survived internal schism, and asserted its religious principles against both ecclesiastical and imperial pressure. For the empire and the church, the agreements were a reluctant acknowledgement that coercion alone could not enforce conformity. In a society committed to reform and willing to defend its principles. Yet, the fragility of this peace was evident from the start. Churches and congregations had to adjust to new practices, reconcile differing interpretations of Scripture, and navigate the presence of both radical and moderate factions. Faith, which had been both cause and justification for decades of war, became a tool for social negotiation and a marker of identity. Bohemian leaders had leveraged military success, internal cohesion, and moral claims to secure recognition without surrendering sovereignty. The compromise was delicate but demonstrated the emerging principle that small kingdoms, when organized and principled, could exert influence far beyond their apparent power. The experience would inform future interactions with the empire, shaping the kingdom's approach to diplomacy, internal governance, and strategic planning. They codified key concessions, recognized Hussite practices, and provided breathing space for a society exhausted by decades of conflict. For the people of Bohemia, the Compacts were a bittersweet victory. At the same time, the agreements underscored the persistent challenges of unity, the limitations of compromise. The kingdom had survived, but it had not been fully healed. Bohemia's society now faced the delicate task of sustaining compromise, managing factional tension, and preparing for the inevitable pressures that would arise once the temporary calm ended. The Compacts of Basel thus stand as a testament to both the power and the limits of negotiation in a war-torn kingdom. Bohemia had forced recognition from Europe's most powerful institutions, embedding the principles of the Hussite movement within law and practice. Yet, the agreements were not a panacea. They deferred, rather than resolved underlying conflicts, providing a temporary framework for coexistence while leaving the kingdom's ideological and political struggles largely intact. The peace was real, but it was provisional. A pause between the storms of a protracted century of conflict. The Compacts of Basel had provided Bohemia with a temporary respite, but the kingdom's internal and external tensions were far from resolved. The decades of Hussite Wars, civil unrest, and negotiated compromises had left a power vacuum in the heart of the kingdom, one that demanded new leadership, capable of navigating a landscape shaped by ideological division, factional rivalries, and the persistent ambitions of the Holy Roman Empire. In the mid-5th century, that leadership emerged in the figure of George Apod Brady, a nobleman of moderate Hussite sympathies, whose rise would reignite the delicate interplay of Bohemian autonomy and imperial oversight. George's ascent to power was a testament to both his personal skill and the exhaustion of competing factions. The Taborites, weakened by decades of internal struggle, no longer wielded the decisive influence they had enjoyed during the height of the Civil War. The Utriquists, while moderate and pragmatic, lacked the martial strength necessary to dominate the kingdom entirely. Into this landscape stepped George, whose diplomatic acuity, political alliances, and reputation for moderation positioned him as a unifying figure capable of reconciling competing interests while asserting the kingdom's independence. His election as regent and later as king represented the culmination of careful negotiation, a balancing act that sought to maintain internal stability while projecting strength externally. George's vision for Bohemia was ambitious, yet grounded. He understood that the kingdom's survival depended not merely on military might, but on a careful orchestration of diplomacy, religious tolerance, and political cohesion. Internally, he sought to stabilize relations between Utriquists and remaining radical factions, reinforcing civic structures while respecting the principles enshrined in the Compacts of Basel. He encouraged towns to maintain their privileges, supported the reconstruction of trade and agriculture, and emphasized the importance of civic order in a kingdom still recovering from decades of war. In doing so, George positioned Bohemia as a polity capable of both self-governance and measured engagement with Europe. Externally, however, the challenge was more formidable. The Holy Roman Empire and the papacy had never fully accepted the notion of a Bohemian ruler who was not strictly aligned with Catholic orthodoxy. George's Hussite background, moderate though it was, represented a symbolic and practical challenge to imperial authority. The emperor and the pope viewed the kingdom's autonomy with suspicion, perceiving George's rule as a precedent that could embolden other regions to defy ecclesiastical or imperial mandates. Negotiations, threats, and political maneuvering became central to George's strategy, as he worked to assert Bohemia's sovereignty while avoiding the immediate eruption of armed conflict. His diplomacy was tested continually, balancing the demands of Europe's most powerful institutions against the realities of domestic governance. The tension between Bohemia's internal consolidation and external pressures became increasingly acute. Georgia's rule emphasized the kingdom's right to self-determination, asserting that religious practice, civic governance, and succession could be regulated within Bohemia without imperial interference. At the same time, he sought recognition, or at least toleration, from neighboring powers, understanding that diplomatic isolation could invite renewed military intervention. This delicate balancing act required both patience and decisiveness. George navigated factional disputes, negotiated with foreign emissaries, and demonstrated that Bohemia's strength lay not only in its past victories but in its capacity to govern itself with discipline and vision. Nevertheless, opposition to George's rule emerged from multiple directions. Radical Taborites, though weakened, continued to question his commitment to Hussite principles, fearing that moderation would dilute the revolutionary ideals that had once driven Bohemia to resist imperial armies. Conservative Catholic nobles, meanwhile, viewed his ascendancy with alarm, interpreting his religious background as a challenge to traditional authority and an obstacle to reconciliation with the wider empire. These internal pressures demanded constant negotiation and occasional suppression, illustrating the fragility of unity in a kingdom shaped by decades of ideological struggle. Governance was a continuous exercise in mediation, balancing competing factions while maintaining the coherence necessary for survival. The imperial response further complicated George's efforts. While the emperor recognized Bohemia's military capability and the difficulties of imposing direct control, he remained committed to the principle that the kingdom should remain aligned with Catholic orthodoxy and imperial prerogatives. Attempts to assert influence took the form of diplomatic conditional recognition and pressure on neighboring principalities to challenge George's authority. The tension between recognition and refusal created an ongoing geopolitical dilemma. Bohemia was de facto autonomous, but its legitimacy, in the eyes of Europe's most powerful authorities, remained contested. Each decision by George had to account for the potential reaction of the empire, the papacy, and allied powers, creating a constant backdrop of uncertainty and strategic calculation. Despite these pressures, George's leadership strengthened the kingdom's sense of identity and autonomy. Bohemia's towns and nobility recognized the practical benefits of a ruler capable of defending internal cohesion while negotiating with external powers. Trade networks began to recover. Fortifications were repaired, and civic institutions, including councils and courts, regained functionality. George leveraged this stability to reinforce Bohemia's diplomatic standing, establishing relations with neighboring states and projecting an image of a kingdom capable of measured but also a reminder that the kingdom's hard-won autonomy rested on fragile foundations. The latter decades of the 5th-10th century and early 16th century saw the slow, inexorable rise of the Habsburg dynasty, whose power, ambition, and longevity would reshape Central Europe for centuries. For Bohemia, the Habsburg Ascendancy represented the final phase in a long struggle between kingdom and empire, a chapter in which decades of carefully negotiated autonomy, ideological experimentation, and military innovation collided with the disciplined expansion of one of Europe's most formidable dynasties. Imperial pressure, once intermittent, became persistent. Habsburg monarchs, backed by both the institutional authority of the Holy Roman Empire and the economic might of their growing territories, gradually imposed conditions that eroded the kingdom's semi-independent status. Bohemia's internal factionalism and enduring legacy of the Hussite era allowed the Habsburgs to exploit divisions, pitting nobles against each other while presenting themselves as stabilizing arbiters and protectors of imperial order. By the late 15th century, these assets became instruments of leverage, control over revenue streams, taxation, and trade provided the Habsburgs with both incentives and pressure points to ensure compliance among Bohemian elites. Nobles who resisted risked economic marginalization or military reprisal, while those who accommodated themselves could secure favor and influence. Religious factors further complicated Bohemia's position. The Hussite tradition, though increasingly tempered by compromise and moderation, remained a cultural and spiritual marker for much of the population. Efforts to reassert Catholic orthodoxy, often framed as moral or spiritual restoration, intersected with broader political aims. Compliance with imperial authority became intertwined with participation in religious conformity, creating tensions that affected both elite negotiation and popular allegiance. The Habsburgs' dual approach political integration and religious influence so to absorb Bohemia fully into a centralized, loyal framework. Despite these pressures, Bohemia did not surrender passively. Nobles, towns, and clergy engaged in negotiation, petitioning, and strategic alliance, attempting to preserve traditional privileges and retain the semblance of autonomy. Military preparedness, though no longer sufficient to challenge the empire outright, remained a component of political leverage. Fortifications were maintained, militias trained, and civic councils active. The kingdom's historical experienced survival against crusades, civil war, and ideological division provided institutional memory and tactical insight that allowed resistance, however constrained, to continue. Bohemia's negotiation was subtle, relying on endurance, cunning, and the assertion of rights rooted in centuries of precedent. Yet the momentum of Habsburg power proved overwhelming. By the early 16th century, the family's dynastic marriages, claims of succession, and strategic appointments left the kingdom with limited room for maneuver. military conflict, while less frequent than previous centuries, still punctuated the period. These conflicts, smaller in scale than the Hussite Wars, nonetheless demonstrated that the kingdom's martial spirit had not vanished. Bohemia's fortresses, militia traditions, and tactical expertise continued to shape local engagements, reminding both inhabitants and imperial authorities that even diminished autonomy carried potential for disruption. The combination of internal division, dynastic pressure, and imperial consolidation left the kingdom unable to maintain the independence that had characterized much of its history. The Habsburg Ascendancy marked a turning point. Bohemia's political fate was increasingly determined not within its own borders, but in dynastic courts, imperial councils, and European alliances. The end of Bohemian independence did not erase its historical legacy. Decades of conflict, compromise, and governance under diverse dynasties had produced a society capable of endurance, adaptation, and ingenuity. Bohemia's experience stood as a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Small kingdoms could resist empires, assert identity, and negotiate autonomy, but even the most resilient societies faced limits against the concentrated power of dynasties like the Habsburgs. Nobles, clergy, townspeople, and kings had navigated the challenges of autonomy, war, and negotiation, demonstrating the kingdom's persistent agency. Its independence, hard-won through generations of courage, conviction, and resistance, had ended. The kingdom remained, but its rulers answered increasingly to an external authority. The centuries of conflict that had defined the region left indelible marks on towns, fortresses, religious practices, and collective memory. The narrative of Bohemia's resilience, the Hussite reforms, the civil strife, and the repeated assertion of autonomy became an enduring part of European consciousness. Story of courage, innovation, and the ultimate limits imposed by dynastic power. The story of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire spans nearly 2 centuries, a tapestry woven from battles, diplomacy, rebellion, and the tireless assertion of identity. By the end of the 16th century, the long arc of conflict had reached a form of resolution. The 186 years of struggle were not neatly concluded in a single treaty or decisive battle. Instead, they resolved through the gradual integration of Bohemia into broader imperial structures. tempered by centuries of precedent, compromise, and resistance that had left the kingdom indelibly marked. Silver from Kutna Hora continued to fuel markets far beyond the kingdom's borders. These lessons shaped the social fabric of towns and villages, instilling a sense of identity, agency, and endurance that would endure well into the early modern period. Chroniclers, poets, and civic records ensured that the story of resistance, compromise, and survival was preserved, providing Bohemia with a collective memory of resilience. Religious life, once the cause of devastating civil wars, entered a new phase. Socially, the kingdom had been transformed by endurance. Families, villages, and towns had survived cycles of conscription, plunder, and ideological upheaval. Entire generations had grown up in the shadow of war, witnessing the rise and fall of kings, the march of crusading armies, and the innovation of defensive strategies. These experiences forged a collective identity characterized by resilience, pragmatism, and cautious. Even as external authority reasserted itself, the memory of struggle remained a potent source of cohesion and pride. The human dimension of the long conflict. The sacrifices, losses, and perseverance of ordinary Bohemians cannot be overstated. Peasants rebuilt fields, plowed under by war. Craftsmen restored workshops, destroyed by sieges. Merchants reopened routes once patrolled by raiders. Communities adapted to shifting authority while maintaining local governance, illustrating the enduring strength of social networks and civic organization. The 186-year struggle left scars, but it also fostered capacities for negotiation, innovation, and survival that would endure far beyond the medieval period. The kingdom moved into an era in which the lessons of warfare, diplomacy, and ideology would inform governance. Cultural development and identity formation. Bohemia's endurance became its defining trait, a reminder that long conflict, though devastating, could also produce resilience, cohesion, and strategic insight. The kingdom as history became both a chronicle of suffering and a testament to human capacity for survival, adaptation, and principled negotiation. Ultimately, the story of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire is one of innovation and the interplay between local identity and imperial ambition. The 186 years of conflict reshaped the kingdom, the empire, and Europe itself. Kings rose and fell. Armies marched and retreated. Ideologies collided, and generations were born into a world defined by war and negotiation. Through it all, Bohemia's identity hardened, informed by experience, conviction, and the relentless demands of survival. The kingdom emerged, not weakened, but defined, a society that had endured, adapted, and asserted its place in the tapestry of European history. The resolution after 186 years did not signify victory for one side alone, but rather the culmination of struggle, compromise, and transformation. Bohemia's journey from ducal independence through royal ambition, rebellion, and ideological revolution to eventual integration under Habsburg influence illustrates the complexity of medieval statecraft, the power of collective identity, and the enduring tension between autonomy and empire. The kingdom's legacy endures as a symbol of resilience, a chronicle of human experience shaped by war, faith, and diplomacy, and a testament to the capacity of societies to survive, adapt, and preserve identity through the most protracted of conflicts. The story of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire is a story of endurance, of a kingdom and a people tested across generations, of ambitions clashing and ideals shaping destinies. For 186 years, Bohemia lived in the shadow of war, rebellion, diplomacy, and negotiation. Its mountains, rivers, and cities bore witness to the passing of kings, the rise of reformers, and the unyielding pressures of imperial authority. Every stone in Prague, every mine in Kutna Hora, every village along the Elba and Vltava carries the memory of a society that struggled to define itself against forces far greater than itself. In the end, the narrative is not merely about battles or treaties. It's about the human spirit and the ways in which identity is forged in the crucible of adversity. The cost of such endurance was immeasurable. Families lived in the constant uncertainty of conflict. Generations were shaped by siege, conscription, and political upheaval. Fields were abandoned, towns were sacked, and ordinary people bore the brunt of campaigns waged by kings, emperors, and reformers alike. The psychological weight of nearly 2 centuries of intermittent warfare left scars on the collective consciousness of the kingdom. Lives were lived in the shadow of both hope and fear. Resilience, tempered by grief. Yet, in spite of hardship, Bohemians rebuilt. Cities rose from ruins, commerce returned to disrupted trade routes, and civic structures regained their function. Survival became an act of quiet defiance, a testament to the ability of human communities to endure in the face of relentless external pressures. At the same time, the conflicts shaped the very identity of Bohemia. From the early ambitions of Ottokar II to the disciplined militias of the Hussites, the kingdom cultivated a culture of self-reliance, courage, and ingenuity. The Hussite Wars, radical yet disciplined, demonstrated that ordinary citizens could stand as equals against the mightiest armies of Europe. The innovations in warfare, civic organization, and religious expression forged a legacy of agency and ingenuity that became inseparable from the Bohemian identity. Generations of citizens internalized the lesson that autonomy was not granted it, was won, defended, and negotiated, often at great cost. Religion, too, bore the weight of this enduring struggle. The execution of Jan Hus and the resulting religious wars revealed the power of faith to inspire both devotion and defiance. Bohemia became a crucible in which theology, politics, and civic life were inseparably intertwined. The Compacts of Basel and the later toleration of moderate Hussite practices were victories of negotiation, compromise, and persistence. Yet they were also reminders of what was lost, of the radical visions curtailed, of ideals challenged, of the costs of maintaining belief in the face of persecution. Faith became not only a personal conviction, but a symbol of cultural resilience, a marker of a society that had withstood centuries of spiritual, political, and military pressure. The political landscape that emerged at the close of this era was both a triumph and a cautionary tale. Under the Habsburgs, Bohemia's autonomy was curtailed, yet the structures of governance, the memory of resistance, and the cohesion of the kingdom's communities ensured that the transition was neither simple nor complete. Nobles and towns navigated the delicate balance between compliance and tradition, integrating into a larger imperial framework while preserving elements of their centuries-long streak. The narrative of Bohemian resilience thus became embedded in the kingdom as social and political culture, an enduring lesson in negotiation, agency, and the assertion of rights. Even when faced with overwhelming power, the impact of this long struggle extended far beyond Bohemia's borders. Military tactics, ideological innovations, and civic strategies developed during the Hussite period influenced Europe at large. Armies studied the discipline and ingenuity of citizen militia. Diplomats observed the careful balance between compromise and assertion. Theologians grappled with the questions Hus and his followers had raised. Bohemia's experience illustrated a fundamental truth. Small kingdoms, through strategy, endurance, and cohesion, could shape the broader currents of European history, challenging the assumptions of empires and altering the trajectories of politics, religion, and culture. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the human dimension. Ordinary citizens, peasants, craftsmen, merchants, and clergy lived through the cumulative weight of 186 years of turmoil. They rebuilt what was destroyed, sustained communities through crisis, and preserved traditions in the midst of upheaval. Their endurance created the foundation upon which later Bohemian culture, identity, and influence would be built. The narrative of Bohemia is inseparable from these lives, the countless unnamed individuals whose sacrifices, courage, and ingenuity shaped the kingdom's survival and its capacity to endure even as empires rose and fell around it. Bohemia's story is also a reflection on the nature of power and its limits. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its prestige and military capacity, never fully subdued the kingdom. Even the Habsburgs, into long-term consolidation, had to negotiate, compromise, and accommodate. Bohemia demonstrated that sovereignty is rarely absolute, yet it is never entirely lost when a society possesses the resilience, cohesion, and cultural identity to assert itself. The kingdom's struggles highlight the interplay between local agency and imperial authority, a dynamic that resonates across centuries. And as Europe transitioned into the early modern period, Bohemia carried forward the lessons of its long conflict. Civic institutions remained informed by experience, legal codes bore the imprint of negotiated settlements, and communities continued to balance autonomy with external obligations. The cultural memory of resistance, adaptation, and negotiation became part of the collective consciousness, shaping literature, folklore, religious practice, and civic identity. The kingdom had endured not merely as a political entity, but as a society defined by its capacity to survive, adapt, and preserve its values in the face of relentless challenges. In reflecting on the full arc of 186 years, one is struck not only by the duration of conflict, but by the depth of its imprint. Bohemia's struggle encompassed not only battles and political maneuvering, but also the shaping of a people, a culture, and an identity. It is a story of kings and nobles, priests and reformers, soldiers and citizens, but most importantly, it is a story of endurance. Each generation inherited the consequences of the previous one, yet each also contributed to the resilience that allowed the kingdom to survive, innovate, and influence the wider world. The emotional weight of this history is profound. Consider the children born into war, the families displaced, the communities rebuilding time and again. Yet within this suffering lies a remarkable testament to human determination. Bohemia's people endured through faith, through courage, through pragmatism, and through unity when it mattered most. They transformed adversity into identity, ensuring that even centuries later, the story of their resistance would remain a touchstone for understanding resilience in the human experience. The legacy of Bohemia's long struggle is visible in Europe's history, politics, and culture. The kingdom's example influenced neighboring regions, showing that even against formidable empires, persistence, strategic insight, and collective will could shape outcomes. Religious reform, civic engagement, and military innovation all carried echoes of Bohemia's experience. Kingdom Ascendancy became a lens through which contemporaries and historians alike could examine the tension between local agency and expansive authority, a tension that continues to define political life in Europe to this day. Finally, the story of Bohemia reminds us of the cost of independence. Yet it also shows the reward of endurance, a culture forged through trial, an identity strengthened by challenge. Bohemia's 186-year struggle with the Holy Roman Empire is a narrative of survival, of adaptation, and of the relentless assertion of identity. In a world dominated by powerful empires, as we close this chapter, the kingdom emerges, not diminished, but defined. Its mountains, rivers, towns, and cities carry the memory of centuries of courage, sacrifice, and ingenuity. Its people, though long absorbed into broader imperial structures, retain the imprint of generations who endured, resisted, and negotiated their place in the world. Bohemia stands as a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of identity, and the enduring human capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive, even when history seems determined to overwhelm. The 186 years of conflict between Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire are not merely a record of battles, treaties, or dynastic shifts. They are a reflection on the resilience of a people, the persistence of culture, and the enduring importance of autonomy in the face of overwhelming power. From the rise of the Přemyslids to the consolidation under the Habsburgs, from the radicalism of Jan Hus to the pragmatic leadership of George of Podbrady, Bohemia's journey is a story of courage, compromise, and identity forged in the crucible of time. It is a story that endures, echoing across centuries, and leaving a lasting imprint on Europe, on faith, and on the human spirit itself.